Hello everyone, I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. I woke up at 5:17 a.m., a full 43 minutes before my alarm was set to sound. The anticipation of our planned hike had kept my mind active through the night, drifting between consciousness and restless sleep. My wife, Josephine, was still wrapped in our comforter, her breathing deep and rhythmic. I watched the ceiling fan rotate in the half-darkness, mentally checking the list of supplies I'd packed the previous evening. By 6:30, Josephine had joined me in the kitchen. She sipped her coffee, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Are you sure about this trail? I've heard Cascade Falls gets pretty crowded on weekends." "That's why we're leaving early," I replied, filling the dog's water bowl. "We'll beat the rush." Our German shepherd Bella sensed the excitement in the air. She paced the kitchen floor, claws clicking against the tile, pausing occasionally to stare at her leash hanging by the door. I'd adopted her as a rescue 3 years ago, and she'd become our faithful hiking companion, always eager to explore new trails. The drive to the trailhead took just over an hour. We wound through the mountains, climbing higher as the road narrowed. Bella pressed her nose against the window, her breath creating small patches of fog on the glass. The morning light filtered through the trees in slanted beams, illuminating particles of dust floating in the car. "Look at the weather," Josephine said, gesturing toward the sky. "Perfect hiking day." She was right. The forecast promised mild temperatures with partly cloudy skies, ideal conditions for the 6-mile trek to Cascade Falls and back. What made this particular trail appealing was its accessibility. It was popular enough to be well maintained, but offered side paths for those seeking more solitude. The parking area was about a quarter full when we arrived, mostly with vehicles bearing out-of-state license plates. Weekend warriors, I thought to myself. Tourists seeking Instagram-worthy photos of the falls. I pulled into a spot near the trailhead and cut the engine. "Ready for this?" I asked, turning to Josephine. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. "Always." Bella's enthusiasm was unmistakable as I clipped the leash to her collar. Her tail wagged with such vigor that her entire body swayed from side to side. I secured our backpacks, checking once more for water bottles, trail mix, first aid supplies, and the pocket knife I always carried on hikes. The air felt crisp against my face as we approached the trailhead. A wooden sign displayed a map of the area, marking the main path and several offshoot trails. I studied it briefly, noting a less traveled route that looped behind the falls into a more secluded section of forest. "I'm thinking we might try that back loop after we see the main falls," I suggested, pointing to the map. "Fewer people, more nature." Josephine nodded, though something in her expression suggested hesitation. "As long as we're back before dark." I assured her we would be, not knowing that darkness would find us long before we returned to our car. The main trail to Cascade Falls stretched before us like a welcoming ribbon, wide and well-trodden. Morning sunlight dappled the path through breaks in the forest canopy, creating pools of warmth on the otherwise cool ground. Other hikers passed us in both directions, offering friendly nods or brief greetings. Bella led our small procession, her nose working overtime as she processed the symphony of scents. Every few minutes, she would pause to investigate something of particular interest, a peculiar rock, a patch of moss, or traces left by wildlife that had crossed the path during the night. "She's in her element," Josephine observed, watching as Bella locked eyes with a gray squirrel that chattered indignantly from a safe perch. The steady incline of the trail increased our heart rates and loosened our muscles. I felt the familiar burn in my calves, welcoming the sensation as proof that I was alive and moving. The sound of rushing water grew progressively louder, signaling our approach to the falls. "I think we're getting close," I said unnecessarily. The roar of Cascade Falls had become unmistakable, a constant backdrop to the chorus of birdsong and rustling leaves. We rounded a final bend in the trail, and the falls revealed themselves in dramatic fashion. Water thundered over a 70-foot cliff, crashing into a clear pool below with such force that a perpetual mist hung in the air. Sunlight filtered through this mist, creating a delicate rainbow that arched across the base of the falls. The area surrounding the pool was crowded with visitors. Families spread picnic blankets on flat rocks, couples posed for photographs with the cascade as their backdrop, and several brave souls waded into the frigid water, their shrieks of shock echoing against the cliff face. "It's beautiful," Josephine said, her voice nearly lost in the roar of the water. We found a relatively quiet spot on a large flat boulder and unpacked our lunch. Bella lay at our feet, watchful but relaxed, occasionally lifting her head when children ran past or when food was being distributed. "So many people," I commented, surveying the crowd. "I wonder if anyone takes that back trail we saw on the map." Josephine followed my gaze toward a narrow path that snaked around the side of the falls, climbing steeply before disappearing into dense forest. "Doesn't look like it gets much traffic." The path called to me with an inexplicable pull. While the falls were undeniably spectacular, something about that hidden trail promised a more authentic experience, a chance to encounter the wilderness on its own terms, away from the carefully curated experience of the main attraction. "Want to check it out?" I asked, already knowing the answer I wanted to hear. Josephine hesitated, taking a long drink from her water bottle. "Is it safe?" "It's marked on the official trail map," I reasoned. "Just less popular." After a moment's consideration, she nodded. "All right, but let's not go too far. I'd like to be back at the car before the sun starts to set." We packed our remains of lunch and set off toward the narrow path, leaving behind the comfort of crowds and cell phone reception. Bella seemed particularly eager for this new adventure, pulling slightly on her leash as we approached the trailhead. A small wooden sign marked the entrance to the path. North Forest Loop, moderate difficulty, 2.5 miles. Below this official marker, someone had carved a single word into the wood: "Watch." I assumed it was a reminder to watch one's step on the steeper terrain, not yet understanding it as the warning it was meant to be. The transition was immediate and striking. Within 50 yards of leaving the main area, the sounds of other hikers faded to a distant murmur, then disappeared entirely. The path narrowed considerably, forcing us to walk single file in some sections. Tree roots created natural steps up the incline, and in places, the trail came perilously close to the edge of a steep drop-off. "Careful here," I called back to Josephine, offering my hand at a particularly treacherous section. We climbed steadily, our breathing becoming more labored. Bella navigated the terrain with ease, her paws finding secure footing where ours sometimes slipped. The forest grew denser around us, the trees taller and more ancient than those near the trailhead. "Notice anything?" Josephine asked after we had been climbing for about 20 minutes. I paused, listening. "It's quiet." The absence of sound was indeed remarkable. The waterfall's roar had diminished to a faint whisper, and even the birds seemed to have abandoned this section of the forest. Our footsteps and breathing became unnaturally loud in the stillness. "No cell service," Josephine noted, glancing at her phone. Not that I'm surprised. We continued our ascent, eventually reaching a point where the trail leveled out and offered a spectacular view of the valley below. The people at the base of the falls looked tiny from our vantage point, like miniature figures in a diorama. "Worth the climb," I said, taking a deep breath of the cool air. Josephine nodded, though I noticed her eyes frequently scanning our surroundings. "It's beautiful, but somehow different up here." I knew what she meant. The forest had a distinct atmosphere, not necessarily threatening, but certainly more primal. The trees were older, their bark deeply furrowed and covered with thick moss. The undergrowth was sparse, allowing our eyes to penetrate deeper into the woods than was possible near the trailhead. "Shall we continue?" I asked, gesturing toward where the trail disappeared into a particularly dense section of forest. The canopy overhead grew thicker as we proceeded, filtering the sunlight into thin, shifting beams that barely illuminated the path. The temperature dropped noticeably, and I felt the first prickle of unease crawl up my spine. Bella's demeanor had changed as well. Her earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more cautious approach. She no longer pulled ahead but stayed close to my side, her ears constantly swiveling to catch any sound. "Is it getting darker?" Josephine asked, her voice hushed as if speaking normally might disturb something we couldn't see. I checked my watch. "It's only 2:30, still plenty of daylight left." Yet she was right. It did seem darker, as if the forest itself was absorbing the light. I attributed it to the thicker canopy and pressed on, trying to ignore the growing sense that we were being observed. The dominant sound now was our own movement, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig, Bella's steady panting. Each noise seemed amplified in the unnatural quiet, traveling further than it should through the still air. "Do you hear any birds?" Josephine asked suddenly. I stopped walking and listened intently. Nothing. No bird song, no rustling in the undergrowth, no distant calls of wildlife. The forest was absolutely silent, holding its sound as if in anticipation. Even then, with warning signs mounting, we continued forward. I was driven by curiosity, by the desire to see what lay just beyond the next bend in the trail. Josephine followed out of loyalty and Bella out of duty, though her body language communicated increasing distress. We were venturing into a part of the forest that felt untouched by human presence. Despite the clear trail beneath our feet, the trees here were ancient sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Moss hung in long strands, occasionally brushing against our faces as we passed. "Maybe we should turn back soon," Josephine suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. I was about to agree when we emerged into a small clearing that stopped me in my tracks. A perfect circle of towering trees surrounded a patch of ground where nothing grew. No grass, no undergrowth, just bare earth that appeared oddly darker than the surrounding soil. "What is this place?" I wondered aloud, my voice sounding foreign in the profound silence. Bella whined softly, pressing herself against my leg. I reached down to reassure her, feeling the tremor that ran through her body. We had found something we were not meant to see, and the forest knew it. The clearing emanated a wrongness I couldn't articulate. While my rational mind searched for natural explanations, perhaps the soil chemistry prevented growth, or maybe the canopy blocked too much sunlight, a more primitive part of my brain recognized danger. "I don't like this," Josephine said, her eyes darting from tree to tree at the edge of the clearing. "Let's go back." I nodded, suddenly eager to retreat. As we turned to leave, something caught my eye, a flash of movement at the periphery of my vision. I whipped my head around, staring into the dense undergrowth, but saw nothing definitive. Just shadows shifting in ways that shadows shouldn't. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. Josephine shook her head, but her expression confirmed she'd sensed something too. "What was it?" "Probably just a deer," I said, not believing it for a second. We backtracked to the main trail, moving with greater purpose now. The forest seemed to close in around us, branches reaching lower, roots rising higher to impede our progress. I told myself it was my imagination, that fear was distorting my perception, but the sensation of being followed intensified with each step. Bella's behavior became increasingly concerning. She walked with her tail tucked between her legs, her ears flattened against her skull. Occasionally, she would stop and stare intently into the forest, growling softly at something I couldn't perceive. "She senses something," Josephine whispered, gripping my arm. I had always trusted Bella's instincts. As a shepherd, she possessed sharper senses and a keener awareness of her surroundings than either of us. If she was afraid, there was reason to be. The trail narrowed further, forcing us to navigate carefully around protruding rocks and fallen branches. The forest floor was covered in a thick layer of decaying leaves that muffled our footsteps, but made the terrain treacherous. Twice I nearly lost my footing on the slippery ground. "Listen," Josephine said suddenly, freezing in place. I held my breath, straining to hear whatever had caught her attention. At first there was nothing but the sound of our own heartbeats pounding in our ears. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, too deliberate to be the wind, too rhythmic to be random forest sounds. "Someone's following us," I whispered, the realization chilling me to my core. We quickened our pace, no longer concerned with enjoying the scenery or exploring new territory. The only objective now was to return to the populated area near the falls, to escape the suffocating presence of the deep forest and whatever lurked within it. The path began to slope downward, which should have been encouraging. We were heading back toward the falls, but instead filled me with dread. The descent made our footing even more precarious, and the sensation of being pursued grew stronger with each passing minute. Bella suddenly stopped, her body rigid with tension. A low growl rumbled in her chest, and the fur along her spine stood on end. She stared fixedly at a dense thicket about 20 yards off the trail. "What is it, girl?" I asked, my voice barely audible. In response, Bella's growl deepened, becoming more threatening. I followed her gaze, but could discern nothing in the shadowy undergrowth. Just as I was about to tug gently on her leash and continue our descent, a branch snapped loudly in the thicket. Josephine gasped, her fingers digging into my arm with bruising force. "There's someone there!" she hissed. I opened my mouth to call out, to demand that whoever was following us show themselves, but the words died in my throat. Some instinct buried deep in my genetic memory warned that announcing our awareness would only escalate the situation. Instead, I whispered to Josephine, "Let's move." Quickly, but quietly. We resumed our descent, moving as rapidly as the treacherous terrain would allow. Bella stayed close, her body tense and alert, her head swiveling constantly to monitor our surroundings. The rustling continued, sometimes fading slightly, sometimes drawing alarmingly near, but always present. The forest grew darker still, though my watch insisted it was only mid-afternoon. A heavy mist had begun to form among the trees, reducing visibility and adding to our disorientation. Landmarks I had noted on our ascent seemed altered or absent entirely, making me question whether we were still on the correct path. "Are we lost?" Josephine asked, voicing my unspoken fear. "No," I replied with false confidence. "The trail only goes one way. We just need to keep heading down." But doubt gnawed at me. The path seemed different, somehow twisted from what I remembered. Trees I didn't recall passing on our way up now loomed before us, their bark scarred with peculiar markings that resembled elongated handprints. "James," Josephine whispered, using my name for the first time since our unease began. "I think we should run." I understood her impulse, but reason prevailed. Too dangerous on this terrain. We'd fall and hurt ourselves. We continued our careful descent, each step feeling like it covered less distance than it should. The rustling behind us grew more pronounced, no longer attempting to disguise itself. Whatever followed us had abandoned subtlety, perhaps sensing our growing fear. Bella's whining increased in pitch and frequency, communicating a distress that transcended language. Her eyes, usually bright and alert, now held a terror that mirrored our own. The mist thickened, coiling around our ankles like spectral tendrils. Visibility decreased to mere yards, the forest beyond dissolving into gray obscurity. The sense of isolation became overwhelming, as if the world beyond this shrouded woodland had ceased to exist. And still we descended, clinging to the hope that the familiar roar of the waterfall would soon reach our ears, signaling our return to safety and civilization. But the forest had other plans for us. The mist parted momentarily, revealing a sight that halted me in my tracks. Ahead, the trail split into two identical paths, both descending at the same angle, both appearing equally worn. I had no memory of such a fork on our ascent. "This isn't right," I muttered, scanning our surroundings for any distinguishing feature that might indicate the correct route. Josephine's face was pale, her eyes wide with mounting panic. "Which way?" I hesitated, acutely aware that choosing incorrectly could lead us deeper into the forest rather than toward safety. Bella provided no guidance. She stood rigidly between the two paths, her attention focused on something behind us. The rustling had stopped. The absence of that sound, which had accompanied us for so long, was somehow more terrifying than its presence. It suggested that whatever had been following us was now still, perhaps watching, perhaps waiting. Left, I decided finally, opting for the path that seemed to descend more steeply. The falls should be downhill. We hadn't taken 3 steps when Bella growled, a sound so unlike her normal vocalization that I barely recognized it as coming from our dog. She planted her paws firmly, refusing to move in the direction I had chosen. "Bella?" Josephine's voice quavered. "What's wrong, girl?" The dog's eyes were fixed on the left-hand path, her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that suddenly seemed more wolf-like than I'd ever noticed. Her growl deepened, reverberating in her chest with primal warning. "Not that way." "Then," I conceded, turning toward the right-hand path. Bella's posture relaxed slightly, though her vigilance remained undiminished. We proceeded cautiously, our senses heightened to painful acuity. Each shadow might conceal a threat. Each sound might herald approach. The forest changed character once more. The trees here were younger, their trunks slender and pale. Sunlight penetrated more readily, creating patterns on the ground that shifted with an almost deliberate quality, as if the light itself was alive and watching. "Do you hear that?" Josephine asked after we had walked for several minutes. I listened intently, expecting to detect the resumed rustling of our pursuer. Instead, I heard a faint but distinct tapping, like wood striking wood at irregular intervals. The sound came from all directions simultaneously, making it impossible to locate its source. "What is that?" I whispered, unconsciously tightening my grip on Bella's leash. "Someone's out there," Josephine replied, her voice barely audible. "All around us." The tapping increased in tempo, growing more insistent. It reminded me of a primitive form of communication, a code I couldn't decipher, but instinctively recognized as meant for us. Bella's ears swiveled continuously, tracking the sounds. Her growl had subsided into a continuous low whine that expressed profound unease. She pressed herself against my leg, seeking reassurance I couldn't honestly provide. The path narrowed again, hemmed in by dense undergrowth that scratched at our arms and caught at our clothing. Moving forward required deliberate effort, as if the forest itself was attempting to impede our progress. "James," Josephine said, her voice tight with fear, "I think we're being herded." The observation struck me with terrible clarity. The splitting of the path, Bella's refusal to take the left fork, the tapping sounds that seemed to urge us forward, all suggested a deliberate manipulation of our movement. We were being guided deeper into the forest, away from the falls and safety, toward some unknown destination. We need to backtrack, I decided, turning to face the way we had come. But the path behind us had vanished, replaced by a wall of vegetation so dense it appeared impenetrable. The forest had closed around us, eliminating retreat as an option. "This isn't possible," Josephine breathed, her face ashen. Yet the evidence was undeniable. We were being deliberately isolated, cut off from escape routes, forced to continue along a path chosen for us by something that understood human psychology all too well. The tapping intensified, its rhythm becoming almost frantic. It conveyed urgency now, an insistence that we proceed without delay. And beneath that sound, barely perceptible but unmistakable, was a low humming, as if dozens of voices were chanting just below the threshold of clear hearing. "We need to run," I said, abandoning my earlier caution. "Whatever's out there, I don't think it wants us to reach the end of this trail." Josephine nodded, her expression resolute despite her fear. We broke into a controlled jog, navigating the uneven terrain as best we could while maintaining our balance. Bella matched our pace, her movements precise despite her obvious distress. The forest reacted to our increased speed. The tapping sounds multiplied, becoming a chaotic percussion that seemed designed to disorient and confuse. The humming grew louder, resolving into distinct voices, though the words remained unintelligible. And now, unmistakably, there was movement in the forest around us. Shapes flitted between trees, always at the edge of clear vision, never quite resolving into identifiable forms. They moved with unnatural speed and fluidity, keeping pace with us effortlessly. "Don't look at them," I gasped, sensing that direct observation would only make the entities more real, more dangerous. "Just keep moving." The path began to slope upward, contradicting my expectation that we should be descending toward the falls. We were being led higher into the mountains, deeper into isolated territory where help would be impossible to find. My lungs burned with exertion, and sweat soaked my clothing despite the cool air. Josephine stumbled beside me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Only Bella maintained her coordination, her instincts overriding her fear. Abruptly, the path terminated in another clearing, larger than the first we had encountered. Unlike the previous bare circle, this one contained a single massive stump at its center, the remnant of a tree that must have been ancient when it was felled. We skidded to a halt at the edge of the clearing, instinctively reluctant to enter the exposed space. The tapping and humming ceased simultaneously, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to press against our eardrums. "What now?" Josephine whispered, her voice hoarse from exertion. Before I could respond, Bella stiffened, her attention locked on the far side of the clearing. A tremor ran through her body, and the whine that escaped her throat communicated pure terror. I followed her gaze and felt my heart seize in my chest. The forest on the opposite side of the clearing was moving. Not with wind, there was no breeze, but with deliberate, coordinated motion. Shadows deepened and coalesced, forming shapes that defied easy categorization. They were neither fully human nor entirely animal, but something that incorporated elements of both while transcending either definition. "Don't move," I breathed, fighting the overwhelming urge to flee. "Don't even blink." The shadows continued their slow advance, edging into the clearing with a patience that suggested absolute confidence in our inability to escape. They moved with a synchronicity that implied a shared consciousness, a collective purpose that centered on the three intruders who had ventured into their domain. In that moment, standing at the edge of the clearing with death approaching in forms I couldn't comprehend, I understood with perfect clarity. We had stumbled into territory that didn't belong to us, had never belonged to humanity. This was old land, governed by rules and entities that predated human civilization by eons, and we had been judged as trespassers. The realization came with startling clarity. We were not meant to witness what was unfolding before us. The clearing, the massive stump, the approaching shadows, all existed in a realm where human observation was an intrusion, a violation of ancient boundaries. Bella's behavior confirmed my intuition. Her body trembled violently, and the whine that escaped her throat rose in pitch until it became almost inaudible to human ears. Her instincts, unclouded by human rationalization, recognized the absolute danger we faced. The shadows had nearly reached the central stump, moving with that unsettling fluid coordination. As they drew closer, details became visible that my mind struggled to process. Elongated limbs that bent at impossible angles, features that shifted and rearranged themselves, surfaces that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "James?" Josephine whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to leave now." I nodded, unable to form words. With infinite caution, I began to edge backward, guiding Josephine and Bella away from the clearing. Each step required immense concentration, fighting against the paralysis of terror that threatened to root us in place. The shadows paused in their advance, seeming to notice our retreat. For a breathless moment, they remained motionless as if considering our actions. Then, with a suddenness that tore a gasp from Josephine's throat, they surged toward us. "Run!" I shouted, abandoning all pretense of stealth. We turned and fled, crashing through undergrowth without regard for the trail. Bella took the lead, her instincts guiding her toward escape with unerring precision. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us. But the terror driving us forward overwhelmed all physical discomfort. Behind us, the forest erupted with sound, not the tapping and humming of before, but a cacophony of inhuman voices, shrieks and howls that contained no recognizable language, yet conveyed unmistakable rage. The pursuit was relentless, gaining ground with every passing second. Josephine stumbled, her foot catching in a concealed root. I grabbed her arm, hauling her upright without breaking stride. "Keep moving!" I gasped, my lungs burning with the effort of speech. The terrain began to slope downward, and I allowed myself a flicker of hope. Downhill meant we were heading toward the falls, toward safety and other people. If we could just maintain our pace, just stay ahead of whatever hunted us through these ancient woods. Bella suddenly skidded to a halt, so abruptly that I nearly collided with her. Her body went rigid, her hackles raised to their full height. A growl rumbled in her chest, deeper and more threatening than any sound I had ever heard her make. I looked up and felt my heart stutter in my chest. The path ahead was blocked by a figure that defied description, a suggestion of humanity distorted beyond recognition, a compilation of forest elements assembled into a mockery of human form. It stood motionless, neither advancing nor retreating, simply existing as an impassable obstacle. "This way," Josephine cried, tugging me to the right, where a narrow gap between densely packed trees offered a potential escape route. We veered from our original course, following this new direction with desperate speed. The sounds of pursuit intensified, seeming to come from all sides now. The forest had awakened fully to our presence, and every living thing within it had joined the hunt. My breath came in ragged gasps, insufficient to feed my oxygen-starved muscles. Josephine fared no better, her face pale with exertion and fear. Only Bella maintained her pace, driven by instincts more powerful than physical limitations. The trees began to thin, allowing more light to penetrate. The undergrowth became less dense, permitting faster movement. And then, gloriously, I heard it, the distant roar of Cascade Falls, barely audible, but unmistakable. "We're getting close," I shouted, renewed energy flowing through my exhausted limbs. "The falls." "I can hear them." Josephine nodded, unable to spare breath for a reply. Her expression mingled hope with lingering terror, unwilling to believe in our escape until it was accomplished. The sounds of pursuit had changed character, becoming more frantic but also more distant. Whatever hunted us seemed reluctant to follow as we approached the boundary of their territory. The realization fueled our final desperate sprint toward safety. Bella led us unerringly, her nose guiding her toward human sense and the promise of protection. The path widened, becoming more defined, showing signs of regular human traffic. Fallen branches had been cleared, overhanging vegetation trimmed back. And then, miraculously, we burst into sunlight. The main trail stretched before us, broad and well-maintained. In the distance, I could see colorful clothing, other hikers, blissfully unaware of the terrors that lurked just beyond their recreational paradise. We collapsed onto the path, our legs finally surrendering to exhaustion. Bella stood guard over us, her attention fixed on the forest we had just escaped, her body still tense with vigilance. "Did that really happen?" Josephine gasped, her voice ragged. "Did we really see?" I had no answer that would make sense of our experience. The rational part of my mind was already constructing explanations. We had become disoriented, misinterpreted natural phenomena, allowed fear to distort our perceptions. But deeper knowledge persisted, immune to rationalization. We had encountered something ancient and inhuman, something that regarded our presence as an invasion to be repelled. And we had been permitted to escape only because we had fled toward boundaries it respected, for now. Bella whined softly, pressing against my side. Her eyes held a wisdom beyond human comprehension, an acceptance of realities we preferred to deny. She had always known such things existed. It was we humans who maintained the comfortable fiction of our dominion over the natural world. Slowly, painfully, we rose to our feet and began the long walk back to the parking area. Other hikers passed us, smiling and nodding, commenting on the beauty of the day and the magnificence of the falls. None of them showed any awareness of the darkness that dwelled just beyond the manicured trails, the ancient presences that watched and waited with inhuman patience. And I lacked both the words and the courage to warn them. The journey back to the parking area progressed in a surreal haze. My body moved automatically, placing one foot before the other, while my mind struggled to process what we had experienced. Josephine walked beside me in silence, her face set in an expression that mingled exhaustion with lingering terror. Bella remained unusually alert, her ears constantly swiveling to catch any sound from behind us. Occasionally she would stop and stare into the forest with focused intensity, as if tracking movement invisible to human eyes. Each time I would tug gently on her leash, urging her forward with a desperation I couldn't fully articulate. Other hikers passed us on the trail, their cheerful greetings and casual conversation jarring against our state of mind. They existed in a different reality, one where the forest was merely a recreational space, a pleasant backdrop for photographs and picnics. Their ignorance felt like both a blessing and an indictment. "They have no idea," Josephine murmured as a laughing family strolled past us. "No idea what's out there." I nodded, uncertain whether I envied or pitied their obliviousness. Maybe that's for the best. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the trail. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated the golden quality of the late afternoon light, the way it transformed the forest into a cathedral of illuminated green and amber. Now, each shadow seemed to harbor potential threats, each darkened space between trees a possible hiding place for watchers. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Josephine asked, her voice so low I barely caught the words. I considered the question carefully, wanting to offer reassurance but unwilling to lie. "I don't think they can," I replied finally. "Or maybe they won't." It felt like there were boundaries, rules. She nodded, accepting this assessment with visible relief. "They could have caught us if they wanted to. They were faster, knew the terrain better, but they stopped. The observation sent a chill through me. She was right. Our escape had been permitted rather than achieved. We had been allowed to flee, perhaps as a warning, perhaps as a message to other potential intruders. As we approached the main viewing area for the falls, the increased human presence provided a sense of security that was largely psychological, but welcome nonetheless. Families were packing up their picnics, photographers capturing final images in the favorable late afternoon light, children squealing as they splashed in the shallower sections of the pool. Bella's tension visibly decreased as we integrated with this crowd. Her tail, which had been tucked tightly against her body, now hung in a more natural position, occasionally offering a tentative wag when children approached to pet her. "She feels safer here," I observed, stroking her head. "Among people," Josephine nodded. "So do I." We paused at the main viewing platform, ostensibly to appreciate the spectacle of Cascade Falls, but actually to reassure ourselves with the presence of dozens of other humans. The waterfall thundered down the cliff face, magnificent and oblivious to the darkness that dwelled just beyond its periphery. A park ranger approached, clipboard in hand, making routine checks before the area closed for the evening. "Heading out soon?" he asked pleasantly. "We'll be closing the gates at sunset." "Yes," I replied, studying his face for any sign that he knew, that he understood what lurked in the deeper sections of the forest he was tasked with overseeing. His expression revealed nothing beyond professional courtesy. "Did you folks make it up to the North Forest Loop?" he inquired, glancing at our muddy boots and the scratches on our arms. "Looks like you had quite the adventure." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to grab him by the shoulders, to shake him and demand to know if he was aware of what existed in the territory he claimed to manage. Instead, I merely nodded. "We started that trail," Josephine interjected, but turned back. "It got intense," the ranger chuckled. "Yeah, that's a challenging route. Not many visitors take it all the way around. Smart of you to know your limits." His casual dismissal of our experience stung, but I recognized the futility of trying to explain. What would I say? That we had encountered entities that defied rational explanation. That the forest itself had seemed to conspire against us. That boundaries existed within his jurisdiction that had nothing to do with park management, and everything to do with ancient territories and their inhuman guardians. "Have there ever been any incidents on that trail?" I asked instead, keeping my tone conversational. "People getting lost or reporting unusual experiences?" The ranger's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of something, caution. Recognition, crossing his features before his professional demeanor reasserted itself. "Nothing official," he replied carefully. "Though we do recommend hikers stick to the main trails unless they're experienced." He held my gaze a beat longer than was comfortable, then glanced at his watch. "You folks should probably start heading back to the parking area. Sunset in about 40 minutes. As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was willing to discuss. Whether from official policy or personal caution, he had chosen not to acknowledge whatever awareness he possessed of the forest's true nature. "Let's go," I said to Josephine, suddenly eager to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and this place before darkness fell completely. The walk back to the parking area proceeded in tense silence. Though we were on the main trail, surrounded by other departing hikers, the sense of being watched never fully dissipated. I found myself constantly scanning the forest edge, searching for movement or shapes that didn't belong. Bella's behavior reinforced my unease. While she no longer displayed the terror that had gripped her in the deeper woods, she remained vigilant, her attention frequently drawn to the forest that flanked the trail. Twice she stopped completely, staring into seemingly empty undergrowth with focused intensity. The parking lot came into view just as the sun touched the western peaks, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Our car sat where we had left it, looking impossibly normal and mundane after the otherworldly experiences of the afternoon. I unlocked the doors with trembling hands, helping Bella into the back seat while Josephine stowed our backpacks. The simple familiar actions felt like a ritual of return, reconnecting us with the ordinary world we had temporarily lost touch with. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I allowed myself a long exhale, releasing tension I had carried for hours. Josephine reached across the console and squeezed my hand, her touch communicating shared trauma and mutual reassurance. "Let's go home," she said softly. I nodded, putting the car in reverse. As I turned to check behind us, my gaze was drawn to the forest edge at the far end of the parking lot. For an instant, so briefly I would later question whether I had seen it at all, a figure stood there, partially obscured by underbrush, but unmistakably watching our departure. It was neither fully human nor completely other, a composite of shadow and substance that existed at the periphery of comprehension, and though I couldn't discern its features clearly, I sensed its message with perfect clarity. "You have been warned. Do not return." I accelerated perhaps more quickly than necessary, guiding the car toward the park exit and the highway beyond. In the rearview mirror, I watched the entrance to Cascade Falls State Park recede, looking ordinary and harmless in the fading light. But I knew better now, and I would never see forests the same way again. 3 weeks have passed since our experience at Cascade Falls. On the surface, life has returned to normal. I go to work. Josephine tends her garden. Bella chases squirrels in our fenced backyard. We engage in the routines and rituals that define ordinary existence, finding comfort in their predictability. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, fundamental changes have occurred. We speak differently about the natural world, choosing our words with a care that borders on superstition. We watch the edge of the small woodland behind our property with newfound wariness. And neither of us has suggested a hiking trip, though autumn weather has provided perfect conditions for outdoor activities. Bella's behavior has altered as well. She refuses to approach the property line where our yard meets the woods, standing at a distance and growling if either of us ventures too close to that boundary. At night, she abandons her customary sleeping spot at the foot of our bed to keep vigil at the bedroom window, her attention fixed on the darkness beyond our small illuminated space. I've done research, searching for explanations or similar accounts. The internet offers various theories: interdimensional beings, cryptids, hallucinations induced by environmental factors. None fully capture what we experienced, yet all contain elements that resonate with our memories. The ranger's reaction haunts me. His careful non-answer to my question suggested knowledge deliberately withheld, experiences documented but not officially acknowledged. I've considered contacting the park administration, perhaps under the guise of academic research, but something always stops me. Some instinct warns that drawing attention to what we witnessed might be dangerous, might mark us in ways I don't fully understand. Sleep comes differently now. When exhaustion finally overcomes vigilance, my dreams are filled with forests that move and shadows that watch. I wake frequently, convinced I've heard tapping against our bedroom window, wood striking wood in patterns too deliberate to be random branches in the wind. Josephine has her own manifestations of the experience. She's begun collecting books on folklore from various cultures, particularly those dealing with forest entities and territorial spirits. She underlines passages describing boundaries between human and non-human domains, rules of engagement for crossing those thresholds, protective measures for those who have witnessed what they shouldn't. "It's not just our culture," she told me last night, her finger tracing a paragraph in a volume of Nordic mythology. "Every society has stories about places where humans aren't welcome, entities that guard against intrusion. We've just forgotten how to listen." Her words carried the weight of revelation. In our modern arrogance, we had assumed ownership of every acre of land, believed our trails and maps and designated recreation areas somehow conferred legitimate access. We had forgotten that older claims existed, that our presence was tolerated rather than welcomed in territories that had never truly been ceded to human control. Yesterday, I found myself driving past the highway exit for Cascade Falls. I hadn't planned the detour. My conscious destination was a client meeting in the next town over. Yet there I was, slowing as the exit approached, feeling an inexplicable pull toward the place that had so terrified us. I didn't take the exit. The memory of Bella's fear, of Josephine's pale face, of shadows moving with impossible coordination, these proved stronger than whatever compulsion drew me toward the falls. But the fact that I felt that pull at all disturbs me profoundly. Are we being called back? Is our unfinished business with the forest reciprocated? The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Bella maintains her vigil at the window. This afternoon I received a small package in the mail. No return address, no note inside. Just a carved wooden figure, roughly the size of my palm, depicting something not quite human and not quite animal. The craftsmanship is exquisite, each detail rendered with unsettling precision. The wood itself is unlike any I recognize, unusually dense, with a grain pattern that seems to shift when viewed from different angles. I haven't shown it to Josephine yet. I'm not sure I will. The figure sits in my desk drawer, simultaneously a warning and an invitation, a reminder of boundaries crossed and knowledge that cannot be unlearned. Sometimes I catch myself staring at trees along the roadside, searching for signs that they are more than they appear. I find myself listening for tapping sounds when walking through quiet neighborhoods. I notice how shadows sometimes move independently of their casting objects, how spaces between trees sometimes seem deeper than physical dimensions would allow. The world has not changed. What has changed is my perception of it, my awareness of layers and territories and presences that had always existed beyond my notice. It's as though I now wear glasses that reveal an additional spectrum, allowing me to glimpse the mechanisms behind the facade of ordinary reality. Bella knows. She has always known. When she stares into seemingly empty corners of our home, when she growls at shadows that look unremarkable to human eyes, when she positions herself between us and perceived threats we cannot detect. She is acknowledging the truth we have only recently discovered, that we share this world with entities beyond our comprehension, that boundaries exist which we cross at our peril. Last night, I dreamed of the clearing with its massive stump. In the dream, I stood alone at the edge of that space, watching as the shadows gathered around the ancient wood. They moved with purpose, conducting some ceremony I could neither comprehend nor describe. And though I remained undetected in my dreaming state, I understood with perfect clarity that I was witnessing something humans were never meant to see. I woke with tears on my face, though I couldn't articulate why I had been crying. Beside me, Josephine slept restlessly, murmuring words in a language I didn't recognize. At the window, Bella stood rigid, her silhouette stark against the night sky, a guardian against forces she understood better than her human companions ever could. We will never return to Cascade Falls. We will warn others away with vague references to difficult terrain or dangerous wildlife. We will carry our knowledge like a secret burden, too outlandish to share yet too significant to forget. But sometimes, in quiet moments when the house is still and the boundary between our yard and the woodland seems particularly thin, I find myself wondering if our experience was unique, or if others have glimpsed what lies beyond the veil of ordinary perception. If so, they keep their silence as we do, understanding that some knowledge is better left unshared. The forest remembers, the forest watches, and we, having briefly trespassed in domains not our own, live with the awareness that we are permitted to exist within boundaries we did not establish and do not control. This is our reality now, and no amount of rational explanation can restore the comfortable ignorance we once enjoyed. The alarm shrieked at 4:47 a.m. on November 15, 2024, dragging me from the depths of uneasy dreams. My wife stirred beside me, her breathing shallow in the pre-dawn darkness. I had been making this trek across the Mojave for 3 years now, every other Friday, carrying medical supplies to remote clinics scattered across the wasteland. The routine had become second nature, yet something about this particular morning felt different, wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I dressed quietly, my movements mechanical in the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Outside, the November air carried an unseasonable warmth that made my skin crawl. The weather reports had mentioned unusual atmospheric pressure, the kind that makes animals restless and sensitive people complain of headaches. Loading my sedan with the medical supplies, I noticed how my hands trembled slightly. The boxes contained standard equipment, bandages, antiseptics, emergency medications, but their weight seemed heavier today. Each container felt like it might contain something more sinister than healing supplies. The rational part of my mind dismissed these thoughts as pre-travel jitters, but deep in my gut, dread coiled like a living thing. My wife appeared on the porch, wrapped in her faded blue robe, her hair a mess of sleep-tousled brown. We exchanged our usual morning pleasantries, but her eyes held a concern I hadn't seen before. She kissed me goodbye with unusual intensity, her lips lingering against mine as if she were trying to memorize the moment. "Drive carefully," she whispered, her voice carrying an undertone of genuine fear. "Something feels off about today." I forced a reassuring smile, but her words echoed my own unspoken concerns. The engine turned over with a reluctant growl, and I pulled out of our driveway as the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon. In my rearview mirror, I watched my wife standing motionless on the porch until the house disappeared behind a rise in the road. The early morning traffic was sparse, just a few long-haul truckers and early commuters heading toward the interstate. As I merged onto Highway 95, the familiar landscape of suburban sprawl gradually gave way to the harsh, unforgiving terrain of the Mojave Desert. The transition always felt like crossing into another world, one where human concerns seemed trivial against the vast indifference of the wasteland. My phone rang as I reached the first checkpoint, my wife's ringtone cutting through the engine noise. I answered through the car's hands-free system, grateful for the company as the empty road stretched endlessly ahead. "How's the drive so far?" she asked, though I could hear the real question beneath. "Are you safe?" "Same as always," I lied, not wanting to voice the creeping unease that had been building since I woke. "Just me and the desert." But even as I spoke, I knew this trip would be different. The morning sun, now fully risen, cast the landscape in harsh, unforgiving light that seemed to expose every crack and crevice in the earth. The shadows fell in strange patterns, creating optical illusions that made me question what I was seeing. Distant mountains wavered in the heat shimmer, appearing and disappearing like mirages. The radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of distant conversations and emergency broadcasts that dissolved into white noise before I could make sense of them. I adjusted the frequency, searching for something stable, but every station seemed infected with the same electronic interference. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the static. As I drove deeper into the desert, the feeling of being watched intensified. It was irrational. There was nothing out here but sand, scrub brush, and the occasional buzzard circling overhead. But I couldn't shake the sensation that unseen eyes were tracking my progress. The desert had always felt alive to me, but today it felt hungry. The sun climbed higher, transforming the desert into a furnace of reflected light and shimmering heat waves. My conversation with my wife continued in fits and starts, punctuated by dead zones where the cell towers couldn't reach. During these silent interludes, the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the whisper of wind against the car windows, a sound that seemed to carry whispered warnings in a language I couldn't understand. Mile marker 127 passed by, then 128, each one marking my deeper penetration into the wasteland's heart. The landscape grew more desolate, more hostile. Stunted Joshua trees reached toward the sky like the arthritic fingers of buried giants, their twisted limbs casting shadows that resembled tortured human forms. Roadkill appeared with increasing frequency, desert creatures that had made the fatal mistake of venturing onto the asphalt during the night. The remains were in various stages of decay, some fresh enough that I could make out the species, others reduced to sun-bleached bones and tattered fur. A coyote lay twisted beside mile marker 131, its jaw locked in what looked like a final scream. Its empty eye socket seemed to track my passage, and I found myself pressing harder on the accelerator without conscious thought. "Are you still there?" My wife's voice crackled through the speakers, startling me back to awareness. "Yeah, sorry, just focused on the road. I didn't mention the growing collection of dead animals or the way the temperature gauge on my dashboard had begun fluctuating, erratically despite the engine running normally." She told me about her plans for the day, mundane domestic activities that seemed to belong to another universe entirely. As she spoke, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision and glanced at the passenger side mirror. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something large and dark keeping pace with the car, running parallel to the highway about 50 yards out. When I looked directly, there was nothing but empty desert. The phenomenon repeated itself several times over the next few miles. Each time I caught a glimpse of movement, something that might have been an animal, or a person, or just a trick of the heat and light, but direct observation revealed only the endless expanse of sand and stone. My hands began to sweat despite the air conditioning, leaving damp prints on the steering wheel. At mile marker 134, I passed a historical marker I'd never noticed before, though I'd driven this route dozens of times. The bronze plaque was weathered and difficult to read, but I caught fragments. Tragic accident. November 15th, 1987. No survivors. The date made my blood freeze, exactly 37 years ago to the day. I tried to focus on my wife's voice, anchoring myself to the normalcy of her presence, but static began interfering with the signal. Her words became fragmented, distorted. "Be careful. Something's wrong. Can you hear?" Before dissolving into electronic chaos. "Hello? Are you there?" I called out, but the line had gone dead. The silence that followed felt different from the usual dead zones, heavier, more oppressive, as if something were actively preventing the connection. The road ahead shimmered with heat mirages that took on increasingly disturbing forms. What should have been simple atmospheric distortions began to resemble scenes of violence. Shadowy figures engaged in struggles, vehicles crashed and burning, bodies scattered across imaginary landscapes that dissolved when I tried to focus on them. My speedometer read 73 minuresi, well within the legal limit, but the sensation of speed felt wrong. The landscape outside my windows seemed to be moving too slowly, as if I were trapped in some temporal anomaly where time itself had become unstable. The sun, despite climbing toward its zenith, cast shadows at impossible angles that hurt to look at directly. A new sound began to penetrate the car's interior, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded me of a massive heartbeat, or perhaps the rotor blades of some distant helicopter, though the sky remained empty of aircraft. The sound grew stronger as I approached mile marker 137, where the road began a series of curves that would wind through a particularly desolate section of the desert. It was here, as I navigated the first gentle bend, that I saw the motorcycle for the first time, a distant speck in my rear-view mirror, approaching at a speed that defied both safety and sanity. The motorcycle grew larger in my mirrors with terrifying rapidity, closing a distance that should have taken minutes in mere seconds. Even from a considerable distance, I could see the rider's posture, hunched low over the handlebars, body language radiating an intensity that bordered on desperation. The bike itself was a sleek sport model, painted in colors that seemed to shift and blur in the desert heat, making it difficult to track visually. My attempts to reconnect with my wife failed repeatedly. The phone showed full signal strength, but every call went straight to a recorded message in a language I didn't recognize, guttural syllables that made my teeth ache. I tried the radio again, searching through frequencies that delivered only static punctuated by what sounded like distant screaming. The rider behind me was clearly exceeding safe speeds by a considerable margin. This stretch of highway was notorious for its deceptive turns. What appeared to be gentle curves from a distance often proved to be sharp bends with insufficient banking and inadequate sightlines. Posted speed limits dropped to 45 mph for good reason, though most drivers ignored the warnings until it was too late. I'd seen the aftermath of accidents on this road before. The desert's extreme conditions turned crash scenes into horrific tableau, metal superheated by the sun, human remains desiccated beyond recognition, personal effects scattered across square miles of wasteland where they would remain for decades. Search and rescue operations were complicated by the terrain and the way the desert seemed to swallow evidence, hiding bodies in ravines and gullies where they might never be found. The motorcycle continued its relentless approach, and I began to make out details that shouldn't have been visible at such a distance. The rider wore no protective gear beyond a helmet that appeared to be cracked or damaged, the surface reflecting light in fractured patterns. His clothing, or what I could see of it, appeared to be torn and stained, as if he'd already been in an accident. But that was impossible. There had been no other vehicles on the road, no signs of any incident. Unless... A chill ran through me despite the desert heat pouring through the windshield. What if I was witnessing something that had already happened? The historical marker's date echoed in my mind. November 15th, 1987. Exactly 37 years ago. The same date, the same stretch of road, the same deadly combination of excessive speed and unforgiving curves. I pressed harder on the accelerator, though I couldn't articulate why. Some primitive instinct was screaming at me to increase the distance between myself and the approaching rider, as if proximity to whatever was happening behind me might somehow trap me in its trajectory. The landscape around me began to change in subtle ways. The color of the sand shifted from its usual tan and gold to deeper, more ominous shades that reminded me of dried blood. The shadows cast by the sparse vegetation seemed to move independently of their sources, writhing and reaching across the highway like grasping fingers. Dead animals appeared with increasing frequency alongside the road, not just the usual roadkill, but creatures that seemed to have died in positions of terror, their limbs contorted as if they'd been fleeing something before death overtook them. A hawk hung motionless in the air above the highway, its wings spread but unmoving, as if it had been frozen mid-flight. The motorcycle was close enough now that I could hear its engine, a high-pitched whine that seemed to harmonize with the mysterious thumping sound that continued to pulse through the air. The combination created a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, threatening to lull me into the same reckless trance that had apparently overtaken the rider. Mile marker 139 flashed past, and I realized I was approaching the most dangerous section of the highway, a series of S-curves that dropped into a natural depression before climbing sharply toward a ridge. The curves were posted at 35 mph with yellow warning signs spaced at regular intervals, but I'd watched countless drivers ignore the warnings and take the turns at highway speed. Most made it through safely, though with obvious strain on their vehicles and nerves. Some didn't. The motorcycle was now close enough that I could see the rider clearly in my mirrors. What I observed made no sense. His helmet was indeed cracked, with fractures running across the surface in a spiderweb pattern. But beneath the damaged visor, I caught glimpses of something that couldn't be right. Shadows where a face should be, or perhaps a face that was all shadows. His riding position was wrong too. Instead of the controlled crouch of an experienced motorcyclist, he seemed to be clinging to the handlebars with desperate intensity, his body language suggesting not skill, but barely controlled panic. Yet the bike continued its perfect trajectory, maintaining impossible speeds with mechanical precision. I was now doing 80 mph in a 65 zone, my speedometer needle dancing nervously as I tried to maintain distance from the approaching nightmare. The rational part of my mind insisted I was experiencing some form of heat-induced hallucination, that the combination of desert conditions and anxiety was creating false perceptions. But the motorcycle was real. Its engine noise was real. And the growing certainty that I was about to witness something unspeakable was more real than anything I'd ever experienced. The first of the S-curves appeared ahead, marked by a yellow diamond sign showing a curving arrow and the number 35. The motorcycle behind me showed no signs of slowing. If anything, its speed seemed to be increasing, the engine note climbing to a scream that made my filling ache. I eased off my own accelerator, hoping to create more distance, but the bike closed the gap with supernatural swiftness. As I entered the first curve, I watched in my rearview mirror as the rider approached the turn at what had to be close to 100 mph. The laws of physics dictated that he would either have to slow dramatically or leave the roadway entirely. There was no middle ground, no margin for error. The rider chose neither option. Instead, he seemed to accelerate into the curve, his bike leaning at an angle that should have sent him sliding across the asphalt in a shower of sparks and torn metal. But somehow, impossibly, the motorcycle held its line, defying both gravity and common sense as it carved through the turn with mechanical precision. I completed my own turn at a more reasonable speed and immediately faced the second curve, this one even sharper than the first. Posted signs warned of a 25 mph recommended speed, with additional placards showing the silhouette of an overturned vehicle. The desert floor beyond the guardrail dropped away into a rocky ravine where several wrecked cars from previous accidents lay rusting in the sand. The motorcycle was now close enough that I could see individual details that made my vision blur with incomprehension. The rider's leather jacket was shredded, revealing what looked like exposed ribs beneath, but not the white of bone. Something darker, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His gloved hands gripped the handlebars with such force that I could see the material bulging around his knuckles, as if tremendous pressure were building up beneath the surface. I took the second curve and immediately saw the third ahead, the sharpest of the series, where the road dropped suddenly before banking hard to the left. A concrete barrier stood between the highway and a nearly vertical drop of at least 100 feet. Metal scars in the barrier testified to previous impacts, and I'd heard stories of vehicles that had gone over the edge and simply vanished into the desert below. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, startling me so badly that I nearly jerked the wheel. The caller ID showed my wife's name, but when I answered, the voice that came through the speakers wasn't hers. "You should have stayed home today," the voice said. It was male, gravelly, speaking through what sounded like a throat full of sand. "Some things are meant to happen." I ended the call immediately, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The phone rang again, but I ignored it, focusing all my attention on the approaching curve. In my mirrors, I could see the motorcycle entering the second turn, still maintaining impossible speed, still defying every law of physics and probability. The third curve rushed toward me, and I found myself trapped in a dilemma. If I maintained my current speed, I would successfully navigate the turn, but would be perfectly positioned to witness whatever was about to happen to the motorcyclist. If I slowed down significantly, I might find myself too close to whatever catastrophe was approaching. I chose to slow down, dropping my speed to 40 mph as I entered the curve. The motorcycle behind me showed no such restraint. Through my mirrors, I watched it approach the deadly turn at undiminished speed, the rider's posture now more desperate than ever. For the first time since I'd noticed him, he seemed to be fighting the machine rather than controlling it, as if the bike had developed a will of its own. What happened next would haunt me for the rest of my life. Instead of attempting to navigate the curve, the motorcycle launched itself straight ahead, following the trajectory it had maintained throughout its impossible journey. The rider made no attempt to turn, no effort to brake. He simply held on as the bike left the roadway, soared over the guardrail, and disappeared into the abyss beyond. The silence that followed was more deafening than any explosion could have been. I pulled to the shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs, and sat motionless for several minutes, trying to process what I'd witnessed. The rational explanation was obvious. A rider had taken the curve too fast and paid the ultimate price. It happened regularly on this stretch of highway. There was nothing supernatural about speed and stupidity combining with fatal results. But nothing about what I'd seen felt natural or explicable. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, muscle memory taking over as I dialed 911. The call connected immediately, but instead of the familiar voice of an emergency dispatcher, I heard only static punctuated by what sounded like distant screaming. I ended the call and tried again, with the same result. On the third attempt, a voice finally answered, but the connection was so poor that I could barely make out the words. "Emergency services. State your location." "There's been a motorcycle accident on Highway 95, mile marker 141, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange in my own ears. "The rider went over the guardrail. I need to check if he's alive." The dispatcher's response dissolved into static and the line went dead. I stared at my phone, noting that it still showed full signal strength, before shoving it into my pocket and grabbing my medical kit from the trunk. The guardrail where the motorcycle had gone over was marked by fresh scratches in the metal, evidence that what I'd witnessed had actually occurred. I approached the edge cautiously, dreading what I might see in the ravine below. The drop was even more severe than it had appeared from the road, a nearly vertical cliff face that fell away into shadows and broken stone. At first, I could see nothing in the gloom below. Then my eyes adjusted, and I began to make out shapes in the darkness. What I saw defied every expectation I'd formed about the crash. The motorcycle lay far below, but not in the mangled wreckage I'd anticipated. Instead, it appeared to be intact, sitting upright on its kickstand as if it had been gently placed there rather than hurled from the highway above. Even more impossibly, I could see a figure standing beside it, the same rider who should have been dead or dying from massive trauma. I called out, my voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Are you injured? Can you hear me?" The figure below turned toward the sound of my voice, and what I saw made my vision swim with vertigo that had nothing to do with the height. Where the rider's face should have been, there was only darkness, not shadow, but an absence of light so complete that it seemed to pull at my eyes, threatening to drag me into its depths. The figure raised one arm in what might have been a wave or a beckon, and I heard a voice drift up from the ravine, not shouted to cover the distance, but whispered, as if the speaker were standing directly beside me. "Come down. Come see what the desert has been hiding." Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, to get back in my car and drive away as fast as possible. But my medical training, my oath to help the injured, compelled me to find a way down to the crash site. I couldn't abandon someone who might be hurt, regardless of how strange the circumstances appeared. I found a game trail that switchbacked down the canyon wall, a narrow path carved by decades of flash floods and desert animals. Each step sent loose rocks clattering into the darkness below, the sound magnified by the canyon's acoustics into an avalanche of noise. The descent took 20 minutes that felt like hours, and with each step, the temperature seemed to drop despite the blazing sun overhead. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying scents that didn't belong in the desert: rot and decay, dampness and mold, the metallic tang of old blood. My breathing became labored, as if the atmosphere itself were becoming hostile to human lungs. When I finally reached the bottom of the ravine, I found myself in a landscape that seemed to exist in a different season, possibly a different century. The sand here was dark, almost black, and littered with debris that had clearly been accumulating for decades. Rusted car parts, bleached bones, fragments of clothing, and personal effects, the detritus of countless accidents that had occurred over the years. But dominating the scene was the motorcycle. Sitting exactly as I'd seen it from above, the machine appeared to be in perfect condition, its chrome gleaming despite the dim light filtering down from the canyon rim. The rider stood beside it, motionless, waiting. I approached cautiously, my medical kit clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Sir, are you injured?" "I'm here to help." The figure turned toward me, and I got my first clear look at what I was dealing with. The man appeared to be in his early 20s, with dark hair and regular features that might have been handsome under different circumstances. But his skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor, and his eyes, when they caught the light, reflected like an animal's. "I've been waiting," he said, his voice carrying the same whispered quality I'd heard from above, waiting for someone to witness. "Someone to remember." "Remember what?" I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want to hear the answer. He gestured toward the scattered debris around us. "All of this, all of us. We keep happening over and over, but no one sees. No one remembers. The desert swallows the evidence, and the world forgets." As my eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering into the ravine, I began to make out more details of the scene around me. What I had initially taken for random debris was actually organized in a disturbing pattern. The rusted metal, bleached bones, and scraps of fabric were arranged in rough circles, as if marking the locations of individual accidents. Each circle contained similar elements: vehicle parts that corresponded to a specific type of crash, personal effects that told a story of final moments, and always, at the center, a collection of bones that had been picked clean by scavengers and bleached white by the desert sun. "How long have you been here?" I asked the rider, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Since November 15th, 1987, he replied, confirming my worst fears. "The same date, the same curve, the same ending. Every year, I make the same ride, hoping someone will finally see, finally understand what this place really is." I looked around the ravine with new eyes, seeing it not as the result of random accidents over time, but as something more deliberate, more malevolent. The desert hadn't simply collected the refuse of human carelessness, it had been feeding on it. "There are others," the rider continued, gesturing toward the organized debris fields. Carmen Delgado, 1987. Crashed her Camaro in the same storm that took me. James Morrison, 1991. Lost control trying to avoid a coyote. Rebecca Chen, 1998. No, wait, you said not to mention certain names. He paused, his reflection on the instruction unsettling me even more than his presence. Susan Walker, 1998. Fell asleep at the wheel coming back from Las Vegas. David Price, 2003. Hydroplaned during a flash flood. Maria Santos, 2007. Rear-ended by a drunk driver and pushed over the edge. The list continued, each name representing a tragedy. A life ended violently in this god-forsaken place. But what disturbed me most was the pattern. Accidents occurring on the same date, November 15th, spanning decades but always returning to this specific location. "Why November 15th? I asked. Because that's when it started, he replied. The first one. Before any of us, before the highway was even built, something happened here that opened a door. The desert learned to hunger for more than water. I knelt beside one of the debris circles, examining what appeared to be the remains of a station wagon from the 1970s. Mixed in with the rusted metal were personal items. A child's toy, a woman's purse, a man's wallet with credit cards that had expired decades ago. But there were other things too. Objects that didn't belong to any recognizable crash scene. Fragments of pottery that looked ancient, Native American in design. Arrowheads carved from obsidian. Bits of bone that appeared too old to belong to recent accidents. Whatever had been claiming lives at this location had been doing so for far longer than the modern highway system. The Mojave tribes knew about this place, the writer said, as if reading my thoughts. They called it the hungry ground, said it was where the earth opened up and swallowed things, animals, people, anything that carried life. They avoided it, told stories to keep their children away. He paused, his unnatural eyes fixed on something in the distance. But then the white settlers came, and they didn't listen to the stories. Built a trading post right here in the canyon. Entire families disappeared one by one until there was no one left to tell what happened. And the highway? Built right over the old trading post. The engineers probably thought they were being practical, following the natural contours of the land. They had no idea they were feeding the hunger, giving it a steady supply of victims. I stood up, my legs unsteady. The medical kit in my hands felt absurdly inadequate for the situation I'd stumbled into. What do you want from me? Tell the story. Make people understand that this isn't just a dangerous curve or a coincidence of dates. Make them understand that some places are fundamentally wrong, that they exist to consume rather than sustain life. No one will believe me. Then the next November 15th, someone else will die here. And the next year, someone else. The cycle will continue because people refuse to acknowledge what they can't understand. I looked around the ravine one more time, trying to memorize details that would help me make sense of what I'd experienced. But even as I focused on individual elements, the organized debris, the ancient artifacts, the impossible survival of the motorcyclist, the scene seemed to be shifting, becoming less distinct. You're starting to forget already, the writer observed. That's how it protects itself. Memory becomes uncertain, details blur, and eventually, you'll convince yourself it was all a heat-induced hallucination. He was right. Even now, I could feel my recollection of the past hour becoming fuzzy around the edges, the supernatural elements fading while the mundane explanations grew stronger. By the time I climbed out of the ravine, I would probably remember only a simple motorcycle accident and a routine rescue operation. Fight it, the writer urged. Write it down as soon as you get home. Record every detail before the desert steals them from your mind. The ascent from the ravine proved far more difficult than the descent. What had seemed like a manageable game trail going down revealed itself as a treacherous scramble over loose rock and crumbling sand. With each step upward, the temperature rose dramatically, as if I were climbing toward the surface of the sun rather than simply returning to the desert floor. My medical kit, which had felt light during the descent, now seemed to weigh 100 pounds. The straps cut into my shoulders, and the metal clasps grew hot enough to burn through my shirt. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing sense that something was following me up the cliff face. I paused frequently to catch my breath and looked back toward the bottom of the canyon. Each time the scene below appeared different, sometimes showing the organized debris circles and impossible motorcycle, sometimes revealing only empty sand and scattered rocks. The rider was visible in some glimpses, absent in others, as if reality itself couldn't decide what version of events to present. During one of these rest stops, halfway up the cliff, I heard voices drifting up from below, not the writer's whispered words, but a chorus of different speakers, men, women, children, all talking at once in overlapping conversations that made no sense individually, but combined into a message of desperate warning. Don't let them forget. Tell someone who will listen. November 15th comes every year. The hungry ground is never satisfied. Remember our names. Remember what happened to us? I fumbled for my phone, thinking to record the voices, but the device showed no signal and wouldn't respond to any input. The screen remained black despite multiple attempts to power it on. as if the canyon's influence extended to electronic devices. The final section of the climb was the most harrowing. The game trail disappeared entirely, forcing me to find handholds in the rock face while loose stones showered down from above. My hands were scraped raw by the time I hauled myself over the edge of the ravine and collapsed on the highway shoulder. Gasping in the superheated air, my sedan sat exactly where I'd left it, looking ordinary and comforting after the nightmare I'd experienced below. But as I approached the vehicle, I noticed details that hadn't been there before, or that I hadn't noticed. A fine coating of sand covered the windshield despite the lack of wind. The tires had collected an unusual amount of debris, as if the car had been driven for miles over rough terrain rather than simply parked on asphalt. Most disturbing of all, the driver's seat was warm to the touch, as if someone had been sitting in it recently. I started the engine with shaking hands, desperate to put distance between myself and the accursed stretch of highway. But as I pulled back onto the road, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror that made my blood freeze. The guardrail where the motorcycle had gone over showed no signs of impact. The metal surface was unmarked, unbent, without even a scratch to indicate that anything had ever struck it. More impossibly still, there was no gap in the barrier, no opening through which a vehicle could have passed. I stopped the car and got out, walking back to examine the guardrail closely. The metal was old and weathered, marked by decades of desert storms and temperature extremes, but completely intact. Paint transfers from previous minor impacts were clearly visible, but none were fresh. None could have been made by a motorcycle just minutes before. Standing at the edge of the drop-off, I peered down into the ravine where I'd just spent the most terrifying hour of my life. What I saw below bore no resemblance to the scene I'd left minutes earlier. The canyon bottom was empty except for a few tumbleweeds and the usual collection of sun-bleached stones. No debris circles, no ancient artifacts, no impossible motorcycle sitting upright in the sand. Even the game trail I'd used for my descent was gone, replaced by a sheer rock face that no human could possibly climb. I returned to my car in a state of complete confusion, my mind struggling to reconcile what I'd experienced with what I was now observing. The most rational explanation was that I'd suffered some form of heat-induced breakdown, a complex hallucination brought on by dehydration and stress. But the scratches on my hands from climbing were real. The sand in my shoes was real. The ache in my muscles from the physical exertion was undeniably real. As I drove away from the cursed location, I tried my phone again. This time it worked perfectly, connecting immediately to emergency services when I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I thought I witnessed a motorcycle accident on Highway 95, near mile marker 141. But when I investigated, I couldn't find any evidence of a crash. There was a pause before the dispatcher responded. Sir, we haven't received any reports of accidents in that area today. Are you certain you saw something that required emergency response? I looked at the clock on my dashboard and felt a chill of recognition. According to the display, only 10 minutes had passed since I'd first spotted the motorcycle in my rearview mirror. 10 minutes for an experience that had felt like hours, for a climb that should have taken at least 30 minutes, for conversations and revelations that had seemed to last far longer than the available time would allow. Never mind, I told the dispatcher. I think I was mistaken. The remainder of my drive passed in a haze of confusion and mounting dread. Every mile marker seemed to mock my experience, counting off the distance from a location where something impossible had occurred. Or hadn't occurred. The uncertainty was perhaps the most maddening aspect of the entire episode. I tried calling my wife several times, needing to hear her voice, to anchor myself to something normal and real. But each attempt went straight to voicemail. The same recorded greeting I'd heard thousands of times before, now sounding foreign and somehow threatening. When I finally reached the remote clinic that was my destination, I went through the motions of delivering the medical supplies like an automaton. The staff there noticed my distracted state, commenting that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Their casual observation struck closer to the truth than they could have known. The drive home should have been routine, a simple reversal of the morning's journey. But as I approached mile marker 141, my hands began to shake on the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway, creating optical illusions that made every distant object look like a motorcycle approaching at high speed. I slowed to a crawl as I passed the location where everything had happened or hadn't happened. The guardrail remained unmarked, the drop-off empty of anything but ordinary desert landscape. But something felt different about the place, as if it were watching me pass, noting my return, filing away my presence for future reference. Once I was safely past the cursed location, I pulled over and attempted to make sense of my experience by writing down every detail I could remember. But even as I tried to capture the events in words, I could feel them slipping away, becoming less distinct, more dreamlike. The writer's face, which had been so vivid during our conversation, now seemed blurred and indistinct. The organized debris in the ravine, which had been so clearly arranged in patterns, now seemed like it might have been random scatter that my stressed mind had imposed meaning upon. Even the physical sensations, the scratches on my hands, the ache in my muscles, began to feel like they might have other explanations. By the time I reached home, I was no longer certain what had actually occurred and what might have been elaborate fantasy. My wife greeted me with her usual warmth, asking about my day as if nothing unusual had happened. When I tried to explain my experience, the words came out jumbled and unconvincing even to my own ears. "You look exhausted," she said, studying my face with concern. "Maybe you should see a doctor. Heat stroke can cause hallucinations, you know." I nodded, accepting the reasonable explanation she offered. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the desert wind whisper against our windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world felt less solid, less reliable, as if I'd glimpsed the fragile boundary between the explicable and the impossible. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of endless highways and shadowy figures beckoning from roadside ditches. I woke repeatedly, checking the calendar on my phone, confirming that the date was indeed November 15th, that this day of strange occurrences was real and not just another layer of the dream. In the weeks that followed, I researched the history of Highway 95, looking for any evidence to support the writer's claims about the location's dark past. I found records of accidents at mile marker 141, more than the statistical average would suggest, but nothing that couldn't be explained by the dangerous curve and poor visibility conditions. The historical marker I'd noticed during my morning drive proved to be more elusive. On subsequent trips, I could never find it again, though I searched carefully each time I passed the location. Whether it had never existed or had simply been removed, I couldn't determine. What haunted me most was the specific nature of the writer's claims about November 15th. I made a point of driving that route every year on that date, watching for any signs of unusual activity. Some years passed without incident, reinforcing my belief that the entire experience had been a heat-induced hallucination. But other years, I saw things in my peripheral vision that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. A glimpse of movement in the ravine below the guardrail. The sound of an engine where no vehicle should be. Fresh scratches in metal that had been unmarked the day before. Never again did I experience anything as vivid and comprehensive as that first encounter. But the accumulation of small incidents, minor impossibilities, and unexplained coincidences gradually convinced me that something genuinely supernatural haunts that stretch of highway. I never found the courage to descend into the ravine again, though I sometimes stopped at the location and called down into the darkness, hoping for some response that would either confirm or deny what I'd experienced. The canyon remained silent, keeping its secrets buried beneath decades of wind-blown sand. Now, years later, I still make that drive occasionally, though I've retired from the medical supply delivery job that originally took me through the area. Each time I pass mile marker 141, I slow down and scan the surrounding desert, looking for signs of the impossible. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see a distant speck in my rearview mirror, approaching at impossible speed, and I remember the writer's words about cycles repeating, about some things being meant to happen. On those occasions, I press harder on the accelerator and pray to God that I never again become a witness to whatever eternal tragedy plays out on that cursed stretch of highway. Some stories are too terrible to observe, and some truths are too dangerous to know. But the writer was right about one thing. Memory fights against forgetting, even when forgetting would be a mercy. And so I carry the weight of that November day, uncertain whether I experienced supernatural horror or elaborate delusion, but certain that some places in this world are fundamentally wrong. hungry for human life and sustained by human suffering. The desert remembers everything, even when we try to forget. I should have recognized the warning signs the moment Will pulled up in that dilapidated sedan he'd borrowed from his older brother. The vehicle itself seemed to harbor some foreboding energy, its faded blue paint peeling away in patches, the passenger side mirror hanging by exposed wires, and the distinct odor of something long forgotten permeating the interior. Under normal circumstances, our 17-year-old selves relied on skateboards or public transportation for our weekend excursions, but having access to a car, regardless of its condition, elevated our sense of independence to dangerous heights. "What do you think?" Will called out through the rolled-down window, his voice betraying an excitement I couldn't fully share. The autumn night air felt unusually cold against my skin as I approached the vehicle, my breath forming small clouds that dissipated into darkness. Devin and Kevin emerged from the shadows of my front yard, both wearing identical expressions of mischievous anticipation. We'd been friends since elementary school, bound together by a shared appetite for minor rebellions, sneaking into abandoned buildings, exploring drainage tunnels, trespassing on construction sites after hours. But tonight felt different somehow. "This thing actually runs?" I asked, running my hand along the rusted hood. "Barely," Will admitted with a laugh that sounded forced, "but it'll get us wherever we want to go tonight." I hesitated before opening the rear passenger door, which protested with an alarming creak. The interior light flickered weakly, illuminating torn upholstery and a dashboard covered in a fine layer of dust. Kevin slid in beside me while Devin claimed the front passenger seat. "Your parents think you're staying at my place tonight, right?" Will confirmed as he adjusted the rearview mirror. I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of our deception. My mother had been particularly anxious lately, warning me about a series of unexplained disappearances in neighboring counties. I'd dismissed her concerns as parental overprotection, but now, sitting in this decrepit vehicle with no clear destination, a subtle current of unease rippled through me. "Let's go someplace we've never been before," Devin suggested, his voice low and eager. "Someplace with a story behind it." The engine coughed to life with a sputtering roar that seemed unnecessarily loud in the quiet suburban street. Will maneuvered the car away from my house, and I watched as the familiar landscape of my neighborhood receded into the darkness behind us. None of us realized that by morning everything would change. Will drove aimlessly at first, taking us through the outskirts of town where streetlights became increasingly scarce. The headlights carved a narrow tunnel of visibility through the encompassing darkness, barely illuminating the crumbling shoulders of these seldom-traveled roads. Every pothole sent shudders through the car's frame, and the suspension groaned in protest with each bump. "Anyone know where we're actually going?" I ventured after nearly 20 minutes of relative silence. "Does it matter?" Kevin responded, his face partially illuminated by the blue glow of his phone screen. "The point is to go somewhere we shouldn't be." The radio only picked up static, creating an unsettling soundtrack to our journey. Occasionally, fragments of voices or music would break through the white noise before dissolving back into indecipherable crackling. Will eventually switched it off, leaving us with only the labored breathing of the engine and the rhythmic thumping of tires against uneven pavement. "I heard about this place," Devin began, his voice taking on that storytelling quality I'd come to recognize. "It's an old psychiatric hospital they shut down in the 80s. Supposedly they just abandoned everything. Patient records, medical equipment, even personal belongings. Some urban explorers found restraints still attached to beds." "We're not, breaking into a mental hospital," I stated firmly, though part of me knew my objection stemmed more from fear than moral considerations. "Why not?" Will glanced at me through the rearview mirror. "Too scary for you?" I didn't answer immediately. Outside my window, the landscape had transformed into dense woodland, the trees pressing close to the road like silent observers. The moon remained obstinately hidden behind a barrier of clouds, denying us even that minimal natural light. "I'm just saying we should be smart about this," I finally replied. "Breaking and entering is an actual crime, not just screwing around." "Fine," Will conceded with audible disappointment, But we need to find something interesting. I didn't borrow this car just to drive in circles all night. The conversation lapsed back into silence. I noticed that we had traveled beyond the reach of cell service, my phone displaying the dreaded no signal message in the upper corner of the screen. That simple technological disconnection heightened my growing sense of isolation. Kevin broke the silence, pointing ahead. "What's that?" In the distance, a solitary light pierced through the darkness. As we approached, the faint outline of a gas station materialized, a small, dilapidated structure that seemed to exist in complete isolation from civilization. "Perfect timing," Will announced, glancing at the fuel gauge that hovered dangerously close to empty. "We need gas anyway." He steered the sedan toward the illuminated forecourt, and as we drew closer, the deteriorated condition of the establishment became increasingly apparent. A single flickering fluorescent light cast an anemic glow over two ancient pumps. The convenience store portion featured windows so grimy they obscured any view of the interior. "This place looks like it hasn't seen a customer in years," I observed as Will pulled alongside one of the pumps. $20 says the cashier has an axe under the counter," Kevin joked, but his laughter sounded hollow and forced. Will killed the engine, and immediately the surrounding silence seemed to press against the car windows with tangible weight. We exchanged glances, each waiting for someone else to make the first move. "Let's just get the gas and find somewhere else to explore," I suggested, unable to disguise the uneasiness in my voice. None of us could have predicted that this decrepit gas station would serve as the gateway to the most terrifying night of our lives. We exited the vehicle with reluctance, each door closing with a finality that echoed across the empty lot. The air felt unusually dense, carrying an earthy dampness that clung to my skin and infiltrated my lungs. Will approached the pump while Devin and Kevin wandered toward the store entrance, their figures distorted by the erratic lighting. I took a few steps away from the car, stretching my legs and surveying our surroundings. Beyond the immediate area of the gas station, the darkness seemed absolute, as if the normal boundaries between objects had dissolved into a singular void. The sensation of being watched prickled along my spine, though I could see nothing beyond the limited reach of the fluorescent glow. Something caught my attention at the edge of the property, a weathered wooden sign partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. Moving closer, I brushed aside tangled vines to reveal faded lettering. Northwood Forest Preserve, entrance. An arrow pointed toward a barely discernible gap in the tree line, where the remnants of a chain-link fence had been pushed aside to create a narrow passage. Beyond this threshold, a dirt path disappeared into dense woodland. "Guys!" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Come look at this." Will abandoned the gas pump, and Devin and Kevin emerged from the store, all three converging on my position. The discovery seemed to electrify them immediately. "A forest preserve?" Devin's eyes widened with interest. "I bet no one comes here at night." "I read something about this place," Kevin added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "There were some weird disappearances around here back in the 70s. Hikers who went in but never came out." "Urban legends," Will dismissed, but I noticed how his gaze kept returning to that dark opening between the trees. "Every forest has stories like that." Devin pulled out his phone, activating the flashlight function and directing the beam toward the path. The light barely penetrated the dense foliage, creating more shadows than illumination. "We should check it out," he declared with growing enthusiasm. "How often do we find something like this?" "I don't think that's a good idea," I protested, the words emerging before I'd fully processed my instinctive aversion. "It's already late and we don't know what's in there." "That's exactly the point," Will countered, already moving toward the fence opening. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" I remained rooted in place, watching as my three friends gravitated toward the forest entrance. Something about that darkness felt fundamentally wrong. Not merely the absence of light, but something actively malevolent. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss this as imagination, but the visceral reaction persisted. "Look," Kevin pointed at something partially visible in the dirt. "There's a trail. It probably cuts straight through to the main road on the other side. It's just a shortcut." "Exactly," Devin agreed eagerly. "We'll just go through and come out on the other side." There's probably another gas station there with better prices anyway. They looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to join their unanimous decision. I hesitated, caught between the desire to maintain our group solidarity and the mounting dread that intensified with each passing moment. "I'll meet you guys on the other side," I finally offered, attempting to sound casual. "I'll take the road around. It can't be that far." Their disappointment was palpable, manifesting in exchanged glances and subtle headshakes. "Seriously?" Will raised an eyebrow. "It's just trees. What do you think is going to happen?" "Nothing," I insisted, not entirely convincing even myself. "I just prefer the road, that's all." After a moment of uncomfortable silence, they relented. We established a meeting point, the gas station presumably located on the opposite side of the preserve, and agreed to reconnect there within 30 minutes. As they disappeared into the darkness, their flashlight beams gradually diminishing until they vanished entirely, I was left alone in the eerie glow of the gas station, questioning my decision even as I felt certain I'd made the right choice. The moment my friends vanished into the forest, an oppressive stillness descended upon the gas station. Even the flickering fluorescent light seemed to dim, as if responding to their absence. I stood motionless for several minutes, straining to hear any sound from the direction they had gone, but the woods remained impenetrably silent. With reluctance, I began walking along the main road, following the perimeter of the forest preserve. According to my calculation, if the preserve wasn't too expansive, I should reach the opposite side within 30 minutes. The knowledge that my friends expected to emerge from those woods in approximately the same time frame provided little comfort. The road stretched before me like an endless ribbon of black asphalt, unmarked and poorly maintained. No streetlights illuminated this neglected stretch, forcing me to rely on my phone's flashlight function, which created a pathetically small circle of visibility. Beyond this artificial glow, the darkness seemed to press against me with almost physical force. As I walked, I became increasingly aware of sounds emanating from the forest, subtle rustlings, the occasional snap of branches, and once a low, throaty sound that might have been an animal or might have been something else entirely. I increased my pace, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead, rather than the dense wall of trees to my right. My mind, desperate for distraction, conjured increasingly disturbing scenarios. What if my friends had become disoriented in the woods? What if they had encountered someone or something that meant them harm? The forest preserve seemed unnaturally dark, as if it absorbed light rather than merely blocking it. Even the edge of the tree line appeared blurred, creating the unsettling impression that the boundary between forest and road was somehow permeable. After 15 minutes of walking, I spotted no sign of civilization ahead. No lights, no buildings, nothing to indicate the presence of another gas station or any human habitation. The road continued its monotonous course through increasingly remote terrain, and the forest preserve showed no indication of ending. Had Devon been wrong about the forest being a shortcut? The possibility that I might be walking in the wrong direction occurred to me, sending a fresh wave of anxiety through my already strained nerves. I considered turning back, perhaps even entering the forest to find my friends, but the thought of stepping into that darkness provoked such intense dread that I continued forward. At the 20-minute mark, I began checking my phone obsessively, hoping for some indication that service had returned. The screen remained stubbornly unchanged. No signal, no messages, no connection to the outside world. The isolation felt complete and suffocating. When I finally glimpsed a distant light, the relief was so overwhelming that I nearly collapsed. The illuminated sign of a gas station gradually materialized in the distance, offering the promise of safety and reunion. I broke into a run, desperate to close the remaining distance and escape the unseen presence that seemed to have been stalking me from the forest edge. The station, marginally more modern than the one we had encountered earlier, featured bright fluorescent lighting that flooded the forecourt with harsh white illumination. A bored-looking attendant glanced up briefly as I burst through the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps, before returning his attention to a magazine spread on the counter. I scanned the small interior frantically, hoping to find Will, Devon, and Kevin waiting for me, perhaps laughing at my unnecessary caution. The store was empty except for the attendant and myself. "Did 3 guys come in here recently?" I asked, trying to control the tremor in my voice. teenagers would have come from the forest preserve? The attendant looked up again, his expression mildly curious. Haven't seen anyone come in for the past hour except you. This information settled in my stomach like a block of ice. According to our plan, my friends should have arrived before me, as the direct route through the forest would have been shorter than my circuitous journey along the road. Their absence could only mean one thing. Something had gone wrong in the woods. The next 30 minutes constituted the longest half hour of my life. I positioned myself near the window, maintaining a clear view of both the forest edge and the road, desperately scanning for any sign of my friends. The convenience store's harsh lighting created a bubble of artificial day that accentuated the impenetrable darkness beyond its boundaries. I paced between the window and the refrigerated section, periodically checking my phone despite knowing it remained without service. The attendant observed my increasingly agitated behavior with growing suspicion until I felt compelled to purchase a bottle of water I didn't want just to justify my continued presence. "You expecting someone?" he finally asked after watching me check the time for perhaps the 20th time. "My friends," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "They should have been here by now." "They coming from town?" He seemed marginally interested, perhaps simply bored enough to engage in conversation. "No, I hesitated, unsure how to explain without sounding irrational. "They took a path through the forest preserve." The attendant's expression shifted subtly, his previous indifference replaced by something resembling concern. "At night? That preserve's not a place people go after dark. Why not?" The question emerged barely above a whisper. He shrugged, returning his attention to his magazine. "Just isn't. Locals know better." This cryptic response did nothing to alleviate my mounting anxiety. I returned to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass as if physical proximity might somehow materialize my missing friends. The forest's edge remained still and impenetrable, revealing nothing of what might be occurring within its depths. As the 40-minute mark approached, I began contemplating the unthinkable, entering the forest myself to search for them. The thought sent waves of terror through me. But the alternative, continuing to wait while something potentially terrible happened to my friends, seemed equally unbearable. I had just resolved to give them 5 more minutes before taking action when movement caught my attention. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a disturbance in the darkness, a shifting of shadows near the forest boundary. Then 3 figures burst from the tree line, moving with the desperate velocity of prey fleeing a predator. Even from a distance, I recognized Will, Devin, and Kevin by their distinctive outlines and the way they moved. Relief flooded through me, immediately followed by renewed dread as I registered their body language. The frantic pace, the repeated glances over their shoulders, the unmistakable manifestations of absolute terror. I abandoned my position at the window and rushed outside, meeting them halfway across the forecourt. Their appearance shocked me more than I could have anticipated. All 3 were drenched in sweat despite the cold night air, their clothes torn and dirty, faces scratched by branches and pale with fear. Devin had lost one shoe, and Kevin's glasses hung askew from one ear, the frame bent beyond repair. "What happened?" I demanded, but they brushed past me without slowing, making directly for the store entrance. Inside, they collapsed into the small seating area, bodies bent over plastic tables, breathing heavily as if they'd run miles rather than the relatively short distance from the forest edge. I followed them inside, my heart pounding with vicarious terror. "What happened in there?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper. Will attempted to speak but managed only a strangled sound before shaking his head helplessly. Kevin removed his damaged glasses entirely, revealing wide, traumatized eyes that darted constantly toward the windows as if expecting pursuit. Devin was the first to regain enough composure to form coherent sentences. "Something was in there with us," he gasped, the words emerging between ragged breaths. "Something was following us the entire time." The fluorescent lighting of the convenience store cast harsh shadows across my friends' faces, accentuating their expressions of terror and exhaustion. We huddled around the small plastic table, our voices barely above whispers, despite being the only customers in the establishment. The attendant maintained a deliberate distance, occasionally glancing in our direction with undisguised wariness. "Start from the beginning," I urged, struggling to control my own mounting fear. "What happened after you entered the forest?" Will ran trembling fingers through his hair, leaving it standing in disheveled peaks. "The path was clear at first," he began, his voice uncharacteristically fragile. "We could see well enough with our flashlights, and it seemed like a straight shot through the preserve. But after about 10 minutes, everything changed. The temperature dropped." Kevin continued, still obsessively cleaning the lenses of his broken glasses. "It got so cold we could see our breath, even though it wasn't that cold outside the woods. And the sounds." He trailed off, looking to Devon as if unable to articulate what they had experienced. Devon nodded, picking up the narrative. "There were sounds that didn't make sense, like footsteps, but not quite right. Too heavy, too deliberate. At first we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it was following us, matching our pace exactly. We stopped to listen," Will added, his gaze fixed on some middle distance as if reliving the moment. "The second we went quiet, whatever it was stopped too. Perfect synchronization. That's when we knew something was wrong." The hairs on my arms stood on end as I imagined them standing motionless in the darkness, listening to the silence that confirmed they were being stalked. Despite the store's heating system, I felt a deep chill settling into my bones. "We tried to hurry," Devon continued, unconsciously rubbing at a deep scratch on his forearm. "But the path kept changing. It would fork when it shouldn't have, or seem to loop back on itself. We started to think we were walking in circles." "That's when the whispering started," Kevin interjected, his voice dropping so low I had to lean forward to hear him. "Like someone was just behind us, muttering things we couldn't quite understand. But whenever we turned around, there was nothing there, just darkness between the trees." Will nodded in confirmation. "We were getting frantic at that point. The path should have taken us straight through to this side in 20 minutes, but we'd been wandering for twice that long. Then Devon's flashlight caught something moving between the trees." Devon's face contorted at the memory. "It was tall, much taller than a person should be, and thin, with limbs that seemed too long and jointed in the wrong places. But the worst part," he faltered, looking to his friends for support. "Its eyes," Kevin finished for him. "When the light hit them, they reflected red. Not like an animal's eyes, something different, something wrong. And they were fixed directly on us, watching us from between the trees. We ran," Will stated simply. "We just ran. The path disappeared completely and we were crashing through underbrush, climbing over fallen logs, slipping in mud. The whole time, we could hear it moving behind us, gaining ground. At one point," Devon added, his voice breaking, "I felt something touch the back of my neck. Not a branch or a leaf, fingers. Cold, dry fingers just barely grazing my skin. The mental image this conjured sent waves of revulsion through me. I found myself unconsciously touching my own neck, as if to reassure myself nothing was there." "The weirdest part," Kevin said after a moment of heavy silence, "was that when we finally broke through to the road, the sound stopped instantly, like whatever was chasing us couldn't, or wouldn't, cross the boundary of the forest." "I looked back," Will admitted, his expression haunted. "Just for a second. It was standing right at the edge of the trees, perfectly still. Then it just wasn't there anymore, like it dissolved into the darkness." We sat in silence for several minutes, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the refrigeration units humming in the background. Normal, mundane sounds that seemed surreal in contrast to the horror my friends had just described. "What was it?" I finally asked, though I knew none of them had an answer. "I don't know," Devon responded, voicing what we were all thinking. "But it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person. At least not entirely." The implication hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. Something existed in those woods that defied conventional explanation. Something predatory, intelligent, and unlike anything we had encountered before. "We need to leave," Will declared suddenly, pushing himself to his feet with visible effort. "Now, get as far away from this place as possible." None of us disagreed. We gathered ourselves and moved toward the exit, each of us casting involuntary glances toward the dark line of trees visible across the road. The forest stood silent and still, revealing nothing of what might be lurking just beyond our perception. The journey back to Will's borrowed sedan remains fragmented in my memory, disconnected images and sensations rather than a coherent sequence. I recall the four of us pressed together in the back seat of a passing truck, having flagged down the bewildered driver with frantic waves and desperate expressions. The man, a middle-aged logger with a graying beard and weathered hands, asked few questions after seeing our condition, agreeing to transport us back to the first gas station where we had left the car. The truck's cabin smelled of pine resin and cigarette smoke, ordinary scents that seemed bizarrely comforting after the inexplicable horrors of the night. Through the window, I watched the forest preserve passing by, its boundary running parallel to the road like a dark wound in the landscape. Occasionally, I thought I detected movement among the trees, fleeting impressions of something keeping pace with the vehicle, but I attributed this to overwrought nerves and exhaustion. Will, Devon, and Kevin maintained absolute silence during the ride, each lost in private contemplation of what they had experienced. The logger, sensing our collective distress, limited his conversation to occasional comments about the unseasonable cold and the poor maintenance of these back roads. His normality, his matter-of-fact existence in this world we had always taken for granted, felt like a tenuous lifeline to sanity. When we reached the original gas station, our benefactor declined Will's fumbling offer of payment, instead extracting a simple promise: stay out of those woods, especially after dark. His knowledge of the preserve's reputation was evident in his expression, though he volunteered no specific information about what might lurk within its boundaries. The sedan waited exactly where we had left it, its mundane imperfections, the peeling paint, the hanging mirror, the oil stain beneath the engine, suddenly precious in their familiarity. We thanked the logger with an intensity that seemed to make him uncomfortable, and he departed with a final warning glance toward the forest before accelerating into the night. Will's hands trembled so severely that inserting the key into the ignition required multiple attempts. The engine's reluctant coughing and sputtering, which had irritated us earlier, now represented salvation. When the vehicle finally lurched into motion, the collective exhalation of relief was audible. We drove in complete silence for the first several miles, maintaining a speed that bordered on reckless despite the poor condition of the road. Only when the forest preserve had receded into the distance, visible only as a dark smudge on the horizon, did the atmosphere in the car begin to thaw slightly. What do we tell people? Kevin finally voiced the question that had been forming in all our minds. About what happened back there? Nothing, Will responded immediately, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. No one would believe us anyway. But shouldn't someone know? Devon pressed, his voice carrying an edge of desperation. What if other people go into those woods? What if they don't make it out? The implication hung in the air, uncontested. Whatever had pursued my friends through the forest preserve had demonstrated intelligence and predatory intent. The possibility that it had claimed previous victims seemed frighteningly plausible. Who would we even tell? I asked. The police? They'd think we were pranking them, or worse, that we were high or drunk. The discussion circled without resolution as the sedan carried us back toward the outskirts of town. Streetlights gradually appeared, their artificial glow never more welcome. Occasional passing cars, glimpses of illuminated windows in distant houses, each sign of human presence helped dilute the concentrated terror of our experience. By the time we reached my neighborhood, the eastern horizon had begun to lighten imperceptibly, the first suggestion of approaching dawn. Will pulled into my driveway and killed the engine, the sudden silence oppressive after hours of mechanical background noise. We should stick together today, Kevin suggested, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. I don't think any of us should be alone right now. Despite our physical and emotional depletion, none of us disagreed with this assessment. The prospect of isolation, of processing the night's events without the validation of shared experience, seemed unbearable. We made arrangements to meet later that morning at Devon's house, whose parents were away for the weekend, providing us with necessary privacy. As I watched the sedan pull away from my driveway, carrying my three friends into the lightning morning, I was struck by the sudden certainty that our relationship had been fundamentally altered. We had crossed a threshold together, witnessed something that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional reality, and this shared knowledge had forged a connection that transcended ordinary friendship. I entered my silent house, careful not to wake my parents, and made my way to my bedroom. Though exhaustion pressed down upon me with almost physical weight, I knew that genuine rest would remain elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tall, distorted figure standing at the forest's edge, watching with reflective red eyes that contained neither humanity nor animal awareness, but something older and infinitely more malevolent. 3 weeks have passed since that night, and the experience has settled into our collective consciousness like a stone into deep water, no longer causing active ripples on the surface, but permanently altering the landscape beneath. We have maintained our unspoken agreement not to discuss what happened with outsiders, partly from fear of ridicule, but primarily because words seem inadequate to convey the reality of what we encountered. Among ourselves, however, we have dissected the event repeatedly, comparing perspectives and searching for rational explanations that might alleviate the persistent horror. None have emerged. The possibility that we imagined or hallucinated the entire episode has been suggested but rejected. Shared delusions don't leave physical evidence, and the scratches on Devon's arms, the mud embedded in the fabric of their clothing, and Kevin's broken glasses serve as tangible reminders that something objectively real occurred in those woods. Our research into the history of Northwood Forest Preserve has yielded disturbing patterns. Local newspaper archives document a series of disappearances dating back to the early 1900s. Hikers, campers, and locals who entered the forest and were never seen again. Most were attributed to misadventure or voluntary departure, but the frequency exceeds statistical probability for an area of that size. More troubling are the accounts from those who experienced similar encounters, but, like us, managed to escape. These stories, preserved in local folklore rather than official records, describe a presence in the woods that stalks, mimics, and occasionally claims unwary trespassers. The descriptions vary in specific details but share common elements: unnatural height, elongated limbs, reflective eyes, and intelligence that exceeds animal instinct. Indigenous legends from before European settlement speak of a territory that belonged to something ancient and territorial, neither spirit nor flesh, but possessing attributes of both. The original inhabitants apparently maintained a respectful distance from the area, conducting rituals at its boundaries to appease whatever dwelled within but never venturing into its domain. These historical fragments provide context but not comfort. If anything, they confirm our worst fears, that the entity in the forest has existed for centuries, predating modern civilization and likely to persist long after our brief lifespans conclude. The knowledge that we encountered something truly ancient and utterly alien continues to disrupt our understanding of reality. Sleep remains problematic for all of us. Will reports recurring nightmares in which he finds himself alone in the forest, hearing the deliberate footsteps approaching from all directions simultaneously. Kevin has developed a habit of checking and rechecking the locks on doors and windows before attempting to rest. Devon, perhaps most severely affected, refuses to turn off lights at night and has developed an intense aversion to wooded areas of any kind. My own psychological response manifests differently. I find myself constantly scanning the spaces between trees, searching for movement that doesn't belong. Urban parks, roadside woods, even the ornamental saplings in shopping center parking lots, all trigger a vigilance that borders on paranoia. I cannot shake the conviction that what we encountered in Northwood Forest Preserve is not unique to that location, but merely one manifestation of something that exists throughout the liminal spaces of our world, watching and waiting from just beyond the boundaries of normal perception. We have made a solemn pact never to return to the forest preserve, a promise that seems almost laughably unnecessary given our collective trauma. Yet the compulsion to understand, to investigate further, occasionally surfaces in our conversations, a dangerous curiosity that we must actively suppress. Last weekend, Will discovered that his brother had sold the sedan, having detected our unauthorized use through the depleted gas tank and unexplained mileage. None of us mourned this development. The vehicle had become another tangible link to that night, its very presence a reminder of decisions we desperately wish we could unmake. Sometimes, in rare moments of rational detachment, I wonder if our experience served some cosmic purpose, if we were meant to glimpse beyond the veil of ordinary reality and carry that knowledge forward. More often, I recognize this as a human attempt to impose meaning on random terror, to extract value from trauma that offers none. What remains certain is that we have been irreversibly changed. The comfortable assumptions that once structured our understanding of the world, that unexplained phenomena eventually yield to scientific explanation, that human perception encompasses all meaningful reality, that darkness contains nothing more threatening than the absence of light, have been permanently disrupted. We continue our daily routines, attend classes, interact with family and friends who remain blissfully unaware of what we now know. In many ways, this normalized existence feels like an elaborate performance, a necessary fiction that allows us to function in a world that suddenly seems paper-thin, a fragile construct beneath which something vast and incomprehensible waits with infinite patience. The forests will always be different for us now, not simply collections of trees and undergrowth, but potential territories for entities that exist beyond human understanding. And as I write these words in the safety of my well-lit room, with the reassuring sounds of my parents moving about downstairs, I cannot escape the knowledge that the boundary between our world and whatever lies beyond is far more permeable than we once believed. Some nights, when I stand at my window looking out at the distant tree line that marks the edge of town, I imagine I can detect a tall, unnaturally thin figure standing motionless among the shadows, watching with reflective eyes that register neither malice nor mercy, but simply an alien awareness. And in those moments I understand with terrible clarity that our escape from Northwood Forest Preserve may have been temporary, not because the entity will pursue us, but because the knowledge it granted can never be unlearned. We know now what lurks in the spaces between trees, in the deepest shadows of the forest. And somewhere in those same shadows it knows us too. I remember how the fire crackled that evening, casting jittery shadows across our campsite in the Adirondack Mountains. It was late June 2023, and at 16 I considered myself something of a wilderness expert. My parents were chatting with some neighbors from the adjacent campsite, swapping stories about fishing spots and the best ways to avoid encounters with wildlife. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke, comforting scents that had accompanied every summer camping trip since I was 7. Jason sat across the fire from me, absently poking at the embers with a stick. We'd been friends since elementary school, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors. He caught my eye and raised an eyebrow, our silent signal. Despite the comfort of the campfire's glow, restlessness tugged at me. Our families would talk for hours, retelling the same stories they shared every year. Meanwhile, the forest beyond our tents beckoned with promise. "I'm getting another soda," I announced to no one in particular. My mother nodded without breaking her conversation. Jason stretched and mumbled something about needing to grab his jacket from his tent. Our midnight explorations had become tradition over the years. Quick adventures while our parents remained oblivious, believing us to be safely within the campground's boundaries. I was so sure of myself back then. 5 consecutive summers of camping had convinced me I knew all the forest's rhythms, which animals emerged at dusk, which trails looped back to the main path, how far I could wander before risking disorientation. The darkness held no mystery I couldn't decode, or so I believed with the unearned confidence of adolescence. "Same route as yesterday?" Jason asked as we slipped past the row of tents at the edge of our campsite. "Let's go farther tonight," I suggested, feeling unusually bold. "I want to check out that ridge we saw during the hike." Jason hesitated. "That's pretty deep in, isn't it?" I shrugged, unwilling to admit that something about tonight felt different. The moon hung low and heavy, periodically vanishing behind drifting clouds. The forest beyond our tents seemed to absorb the darkness rather than merely exist within it, as though the trees themselves were pressing inward, contracting around our small pocket of civilization. A strange uneasiness nagged at me, but I refused to acknowledge it. Pride has always been my downfall. We stood at the perimeter of the campground, that invisible boundary between safety and adventure. The glow of multiple campfires dotted the clearing behind us, while ahead lay only shadow and mystery. Jason clicked on his flashlight, casting a narrow beam that barely penetrated the wall of trees. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice dropping to a whisper, though no one was near enough to hear. I nodded, ignoring the faint tremor that ran through me. "We've gone out at night dozens of times. What's different about tonight?" What was different? Something in the atmosphere, perhaps. The unusual stillness of the air, the absence of the typical forest ambiance. No cricket chorus, no distant owl hoots. Just a pressing silence that seemed to wait for something. "We'll just go to the first clearing and back," I promised, though I had no intention of cutting our adventure short. 30 minutes tops," Jason nodded, seemingly reassured. I led the way, stepping carefully over the border of small stones that mark the edge of the designated camping area. There's a certain electric thrill in leaving the secure glow of civilization and stepping into near-total darkness. The forest immediately enveloped us, and the temperature dropped several degrees. Twigs snapped beneath our shoes, each crack amplified in the unusual quiet. The smell of damp earth hung thick around us, carrying hints of decay and growth simultaneously. Usually we hovered around the outskirts, close enough to still glimpse the reassuring embers of our campfire through gaps in the foliage. But tonight, some combination of boredom and bravado pushed us to test our boundaries. "Let's head toward that ridge," I suggested, pointing vaguely northeast. "Should take us 15 minutes to reach it." 15 minutes is already farther than we usually go, Jason remarked. But he followed without further protest. We moved deeper into the woodland, our flashlight beams bouncing erratically across twisted trunks and dense undergrowth. The familiar trails gradually gave way to less trodden paths. With each step, the campground's ambient sounds, distant laughter, muted conversations, the occasional bark of someone's dog, faded into nothingness. "We should mark our trail," Jason suggested after several minutes of silent walking. "Break some branches or something." I laughed, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "What are we, children in a fairy tale? We know these woods." The confidence in my voice didn't quite match the growing uneasiness in my gut. Something felt wrong, not just different but fundamentally wrong, about the forest tonight. Yet pride prevented me from admitting it, even to myself. The farther we ventured, the more oppressive the quiet became. You'd expect a forest at night to buzz with life, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the symphony of insects, the whisper of leaves stirred by the gentlest breeze. But the silence had weight and presence. It filled my head and pressed against my eardrums, making every tiny sound. The crunch of damp leaves, the crack of a twig, the whisper of fabric as Jason shifted beside me, seemed intrusive and jarring. We exchanged nervous grins that did nothing to mask the tension building between us. Both of us found ourselves scanning the spaces between trees, eyes straining to make sense of the shifting shadows. After 20 minutes of walking, I realized we had penetrated much deeper into the forest than ever before. The terrain had changed subtly, more rocks underfoot, thicker underbrush, trees growing closer together. I glanced back, hoping to catch some reassuring glimpse of our campsite, some distant flicker of firelight. There was nothing but blackness stretching in all directions. "Hey," Jason whispered, his voice tight. "Do you know which way is back?" "Of course," I lied, pointing with false confidence. "We've been walking pretty much in a straight line. Camp is that way." Jason didn't look convinced, but he nodded anyway. Neither of us wanted to admit we might have made a mistake. That's when I first heard it. What sounded like a voice so faint I almost convinced myself it was imagination. Like someone whispering a secret directly behind me, the words indistinct but the cadence unmistakably human. My body tensed instantly. Jason must have noticed my reaction because he snapped his flashlight beam toward me. "What's wrong?" "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Hear what?" I shook my head, unwilling to articulate what I'd heard. "Nothing. Probably just the wind." Jason swept his flashlight in a wide arc, the bright beam tearing through the darkness around us. We both spun slowly, scanning the surrounding forest for anything. But there were only trees, twisted, knotted trunks rising from the forest floor like ancient sentries. Fallen branches, dense patches of ferns, no figures. No faces. I told myself I was overreacting. It must have been a trick of the wind rustling through dry leaves. Except there was no wind that night. The air remained thick and still, unusually heavy for a summer evening. We hovered there in uneasy silence, our ragged breathing embarrassingly loud. Finally, we turned our flashlights off again, stubborn pride reasserting itself. This was supposed to be our tradition, our adventure. If we gave up every time the woods spooked us, we wouldn't be half as tough as we pretended to be. Still, we picked up our pace, silently agreeing we'd gone far enough for one night. I tried to laugh it off, calling myself a baby, but the joke fell flat. Jason didn't respond, just kept glancing behind us as though expecting something to lunge from the shadows at any moment. Another whisper drifted through the darkness. This time it was clearer, something almost like syllables forming words. No discernible meaning, just raw sound like a half-formed sentence cut short. My pulse throbbed in my ears, drowning out everything except that faint, persistent murmuring. We froze simultaneously, not daring to move. Fear warred with curiosity in my mind. Part of me wanted to bolt back toward what I hoped was the direction of camp. Another part, the stubborn, prideful part, refused to show fear, especially in front of Jason. Someone else from the campground, Jason suggested, his voice cracking slightly. I shook my head. Nobody comes out this far. For the first time, I realized with stark clarity that if we'd misjudged where we were, we could be genuinely lost. There's a particular panic that rises when you don't know if safety is just beyond the next tree or miles away across unfamiliar terrain. It starts as a tightness in your chest and spreads outward, making your fingertips tingle and your throat constrict. I nudged Jason with my elbow. Without a word, we turned back the way we believed we had come. We wanted desperately to believe we were still in familiar territory, but everything looked different in the dark. Every knotted trunk seemed like an unfamiliar face, every shifting shadow a hidden threat. The air felt charged with strange energy, sending waves of goosebumps up my arms despite the summer warmth. Then came a jolt of realization. We weren't hearing nighttime critters or a breeze stirring leaves. Something was out here making those sounds, something with a voice, and it didn't feel like a wandering camper singing off-key or whispering to a friend. It sounded wrong. The cadence was off, the timbre unnatural, as though someone had forgotten how human speech was supposed to sound. We walked faster, our earlier bravado evaporating with each step. My flashlight quivered in my grip, its beam dancing erratically across the forest floor. Each footfall crackled over fallen branches and dried leaves, broadcasting our presence to whatever might be listening. Jason locked eyes with me, and in that glance I saw the same mix of fear and stubborn determination I felt. We weren't about to break into a panicked run, not yet. But deep down, I think both of us wanted to. Branches scraped against our arms, snagging our sleeves and leaving thin scratches across exposed skin. The hush of the forest turned oppressive, as if every living thing was collectively holding back, watching our progress with silent interest. Just when I thought my nerves couldn't stretch any tighter, another whisper sliced through the silence. It was close, so close I almost felt breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but saw only darkness. Jason and I stopped dead in our tracks. We exchanged a look that all but screamed, "This is enough." We had no clue what was lurking out here, but it wasn't something we wanted to meet. We switched on our flashlights without hesitation this time, sweeping the beams over the undergrowth and between the trees. My mouth felt parched, my throat tight with fear. I just wanted to see a familiar landmark, anything to reassure me we were on the right path home. But the light revealed only more trees, more endless darkness stretching in all directions. No sign of the main trail, no glimpse of distant campfires. Nothing but forest. A swell of dread rose in me. It wasn't just about being lost anymore. It was the sinking sense that something was out here, moving just out of sight, watching us stumble blindly through its domain. "I think we need to head west," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The campground should be that way." "How do you know which way is west?" Jason demanded, panic edging into his tone. I didn't. I was guessing, desperately trying to maintain some illusion of control over the situation. I grabbed Jason's arm and pulled him forward in the direction that felt right. We both knew we had to keep moving, had to find our way back to our campsite's warm glow, where maybe we could laugh this off in the safety of flickering firelight. But a deep part of me knew that even if we managed to find our way home, the night wouldn't let us off so easily. Something had changed, and the forest wasn't about to let us forget how vulnerable we truly were. By the time Jason and I decided we couldn't push our luck any further, the darkness around us felt almost suffocating. We forced ourselves to keep moving toward what we hoped was the way back, every step echoing like a beacon announcing our presence. The quiet we'd been half ignoring earlier now felt unsettlingly total. Even though there were two of us, I couldn't help feeling like a lone trespasser in a place where humans didn't belong. I raised my flashlight, heart pounding against my ribs. Something flickered across the edge of its beam. A shape hunched in the undergrowth about 20 yards ahead. In that split second, every instinct shouted to turn around and run, but my feet stayed rooted to the spot. Jason caught sight of it too, and his grip tightened on my arm until I could feel fingernails digging into my skin. Neither of us spoke. We just stared as the figure crawled, almost slithered through a patch of dead leaves. Ragged clothes clung to the form, dark tattered cloth streaked with mud and what might have been blood. At first I couldn't decide if it was human or animal. The posture seemed wrong, too low to the ground, too fluid in its movements. A muffled voice reached my ears. Words tumbled out, though they were strange and half-formed, almost as if the speaker had forgotten how language was supposed to work. Disjointed phrases, fragments of sentences that made no immediate sense. Jason flicked his flashlight higher, illuminating the person's face. It was a woman, perhaps in her 30s, her features pinched with fear or delirium. Dirt smeared her cheeks and forehead, and her hair stuck out in clumps, tangled with leaves and small twigs. She looked at us with wide, frantic eyes that reflected our flashlight beams like those of a cornered animal. I stood there, too stunned to move. The woman pulled herself upright, swaying dangerously, and mumbled something about finding her campsite. There was a desperation in her voice that felt all wrong this far into the woods at this hour. "Please," she said, the word clear among the garbled phrases. "Can't find my way back. Part of me wanted to back away." Everything about her presence set off internal alarms. She shouldn't be here, alone in the darkness, crawling through the underbrush. But she looked helpless in a way that couldn't be ignored. Lost, confused, possibly injured. Jason and I exchanged glances, and even though terror still coursed through me, I knew we had to do something. We couldn't leave her out here, not in this state. "We're heading back to the campground," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You can come with us. Your campsite." "Which one?" Jason asked. "Site 47, she mumbled. "By the lake path." I knew that area. It was on the opposite side of the campground from our site, near where the more serious partiers tended to gather. We offered to guide her back, and she mumbled what might have been a yes. Without warning, she lurched forward, wobbling like she might collapse at any second. I stepped in to keep her from tumbling into a thorny bush, and Jason moved to her other side. That close, I noticed an odd chemical smell on her breath. Alcohol certainly, but something else too, sharper, more medicinal. Her eyes darted around as if searching for something lurking in the shadows. I found myself following her gaze, half expecting to see shapes moving between the trees. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to establish some normalcy. "Vera," she said after a long pause, as if she'd had to search her memory for the answer. "I'm Jason. And this is—" Jason began. "We need to go," Vera interrupted, suddenly urgent. "They're still out here." A chill ran through me. "Who's still out here?" She didn't answer, just pulled at my arm with surprising strength. We set off in a slow, awkward shuffle, each of us supporting Vera by an elbow. The journey back felt endless. Every few steps, she would stumble or change direction abruptly, forcing us to adjust our grip to keep her upright. Every so often she'd mutter disjointed phrases, a name I didn't recognize, a random number, a broken sentence that trailed off into nothing. Once, she stopped altogether, her body going rigid as she scanned the dark spaces between the trees as if convinced somebody else was out there. I found myself scanning too, imagining shapes slipping between trunks just out of sight. Twigs snapped beneath our feet, but I still half suspected we weren't the only ones moving through the forest that night. "Someone's following us," Vera whispered, her voice suddenly clear. "Been following me all night?" "There's nobody out here but us," Jason said, though he didn't sound convinced. Vera let out a gasp at one point, jerking backward so violently that I nearly lost my grip on her arm. For a moment I feared she'd bolt back into the darkness, vanishing among the trees before we could stop her. Jason and I tightened our hold, urging her to keep moving. "It's okay," I said, not believing my own words. "We're almost back." The forest pressed in on us, a maze of silhouetted branches and wet leaves that crushed underfoot. Despite our flashlights, the trail was hard to follow, if we were even on a trail at all. I found myself squinting ahead, searching for even the faintest glow from the campgrounds. Vera's weight grew heavier against me as she seemed to lose what little coordination she had left. Her mumbling became more frequent, more urgent, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath whenever a sound emerged from the darkness around us. Eventually, after what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, the tree line began to thin. Through gaps in the foliage, I caught glimpses of a dull orange flicker, a campfire in the distance. Relief surged through me, but it was laced with lingering unease, like stepping into a safe zone while still expecting trouble to pounce from behind. "Almost there," Jason said, his voice tight with exhaustion and residual fear. Vera nodded weakly, her steps becoming marginally more coordinated as we approached civilization. The whispers that had haunted us deeper in the forest seemed to recede, replaced by distant human voices and the occasional burst of laughter from the campground ahead. When we finally staggered out of the woods, we found ourselves near campsite 47, just as Vera had indicated. A group of 4 people sat around a smoldering fire pit, beer cans glinting in the dying light. They glanced our way with expressions as disoriented as Vera herself appeared. One of them, a heavy-set man with a patchy beard, recognized her and came stumbling forward. "Where'd you wander off to?" he slurred, grabbing her arm roughly. "Been gone for fucking ever." They seemed clueless about how long she'd been missing or how far into the woods she'd gone. My friend and I could barely wrap our heads around their nonchalance, considering how close she'd come to being lost for good. "She was pretty far out," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. "Crawling around in the dirt," the man shrugged. "She does that sometimes when she's had a few too many. Gets these ideas in her head." Another member of their group, a woman with dyed blonde hair, approached and helped guide Vera to a log by their dying fire. "Thanks for bringing her back," she said with more sincerity than the man had shown. She wandered off after we finished a bottle of whiskey, probably looking for a place to pee, and got turned around. We helped Vera sit down, and the group thanked us in that half-dazed, unbothered way of people who'd been drinking heavily. No questions about the unnerving trek through pitch-black woods or the bizarre ramblings she'd uttered along the path. Just a casual shrug of relief, like it was no big deal. Jason and I stepped away, still rattled by everything we'd experienced. The tension from that search in the dark clung to us, and everything about our own campsite, our families chatting, the warm flicker of our own fire, now felt like a haven we'd taken for granted. We walked back in near silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The woods seemed calmer here, maybe because the camp was so close, but I caught myself glancing behind me, expecting to see some other figure staggering out of the shadows. Even safe in the ring of familiar tents and hushed conversation, a part of me stayed on edge. I knew I wouldn't sleep soundly that night, maybe not for the rest of the trip. Our families asked if we had fun on our walk, and we fed them some half-truths. We weren't ready to relive the details, and they probably wouldn't have believed how terrifying the whole thing had felt. Later, when I tried to rest in my sleeping bag, I kept picturing Vera's dirt-streaked face and the haunted look she'd given the trees around us. I wondered what she'd really been running from out there, what she thought was following her. Had it been purely alcohol-induced paranoia, or had she sensed something in those woods that we'd only glimpsed the edges of, in some dark corner of my imagination? I swore there were whispers still drifting through the night air, calling out in the silent forest, waiting for the next pair of unsuspecting kids, brave or foolish enough to venture too far off the beaten path. 3 years have passed since that night, but I've never gone camping again. Jason and I don't talk about what happened, though sometimes I catch him looking over his shoulder when we walk through the park at dusk. Some experiences change you permanently, rewiring your instincts and perceptions. I've tried to convince myself that Vera was just an intoxicated woman who wandered too far from her campsite, that the whispers were just the wind or my imagination working overtime, that the feeling of being watched was nothing more than ordinary fear amplified by darkness and unfamiliar surroundings. But on quiet nights when I'm alone, I can still hear those whispers, not quite human, not quite animal, calling from somewhere deep in the recesses of my memory. And I know with absolute certainty that something was out there in the forest that night, something that remains nameless, something that waits,